Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The old wooden bridge groaned beneath our unsteady feet like the spine of some ancient beast disturbed from its slumber. 4 of us stumbled across its weathered planks. Marcus, Danny, Jake, and myself, our laughter echoing hollow in the thick autumn air that hung over Miller's Creek like a shroud. The alcohol had made everything feel both sharper and softer somehow, the way whiskey tends to blur the edges of reality while magnifying every sensation. It was Marcus who suggested we stop halfway across. The bridge stretched nearly 200 feet over the narrow gorge, its wooden railings worn smooth by decades of hands that had gripped them in wonder, fear, or desperation. Below us, the creek moved like black silk in the moonlight, and somewhere in that darkness, the perfect conditions existed for what Marcus called the best dam echo in 3 counties. The mist rose from the water in ghostly tendrils, and I remember thinking how it seemed to reach for us with fingers of vapor, probing and curious. The night felt wrong somehow, though I couldn't articulate why. Perhaps it was the way the usual sounds of the forest had fallen silent, or how the moon cast shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Even in my alcohol-hazed state, some primitive part of my brain was sending up warning flares. Marcus leaned against the railing, his breath forming small clouds in the chill air. He was always the loudest of our group, the one who never met a silence he couldn't fill with his voice. Danny and Jake flanked him on either side while I hung back slightly, suddenly feeling like an observer rather than a participant in whatever was about to unfold. The gorge below us seemed to breathe with its own rhythm, the mist pulsing and swirling in patterns that made my eyes water when I tried to follow them. The wooden planks beneath my feet felt unstable, though I knew the bridge had stood for over 50 years. Every fiber seemed to vibrate with some frequency just below the threshold of hearing, like the low rumble of distant thunder that you feel in your chest before your ears register the sound. Marcus cupped his hands around his mouth, the universal gesture of someone about to make noise they probably shouldn't. The anticipation hung in the air like the mist below us, thick and expectant. In that moment before he shouted, I had the strangest sensation of standing on the edge of something far more significant than a wooden bridge over a creek. It felt like a threshold, a boundary between what was and what could be. When Marcus finally called out his name, his voice cut through the night air with startling clarity. "Marcus!" he bellowed, the sound rolling down into the gorge with authority and purpose. We waited, all of us leaning forward slightly, ears straining for the familiar bounce of sound off stone and water that would send his voice back to us transformed but recognizable. The silence stretched longer than it should have. In a gorge like this, with perfect acoustic conditions, the echo should have returned within seconds, but we waited and waited until the very air seemed to thicken around us with anticipation. Danny shifted nervously beside me, his earlier enthusiasm dampened by the unnatural quiet that had swallowed Marcus's shout. Then it came back. "Marcus Ashworth!" The voice that returned to us was definitely human, definitely male, but it carried a resonance that made my spine crawl. It was louder than Marcus's original call, richer somehow, as if it had been filtered through something that had given it weight and substance it hadn't possessed before. But more disturbing than the enhanced volume was the addition of that surname, Ashworth, a name none of us had ever heard before, certainly not one that belonged to any of us. Marcus stepped back from the railing as if it had suddenly become electrified. The color drained from his face even in the pale moonlight, and I watched as his hands began to tremble. Danny let out a nervous laugh that died quickly in the oppressive air, while Jake just stared down into the mist as if he could will an explanation to materialize from its depths. I felt my heart rate accelerate, the alcohol in my system suddenly seeming inadequate to dull the sharp edge of fear that was beginning to slice through my consciousness. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps someone else was down there. Perhaps the acoustic properties of the gorge had somehow distorted the sound. Perhaps we had all simply misheard what came back to us. But deep down, in that primitive part of the brain that had kept our ancestors alive through countless dark nights, I knew that something was fundamentally wrong with what had just occurred. Marcus cleared his throat, his voice smaller now, uncertain. He suggested that maybe it was just a weird echo, that sometimes sound could play tricks in places like this. But even as he spoke, I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes, the way his gaze kept flicking back to the railing as if expecting something to emerge from the mist below. Danny was the next to try. His voice cracked slightly as he called his own name down into the gorge, and this time we didn't have to wait as long. The response came back swift and sure. Danny Ashworth. The same enhanced volume, the same impossible surname that belonged to none of us. Danny stumbled backward so quickly he nearly knocked Jake over, his face a mask of confusion and growing terror. The mist below us seemed to swirl with more purpose now, forming shapes that almost looked like faces before dissolving back into shapeless vapor. The wooden bridge beneath our feet felt less stable with each passing moment, as if the very foundations of reality were beginning to shift and warp around us. Jake volunteered next, though his voice shook as he made the offer. When he shouted his name into the darkness, the response that came back, Jake Ashworth, sent all of us stumbling toward the center of the bridge, away from the railings that suddenly felt like the edges of an abyss that might swallow us whole. The night air had grown thick and oppressive, pressing down on us like a physical weight. My skin felt clammy despite the chill, and I became hyper-aware of every sensation: the rough texture of the wooden planks beneath my feet, the metallic taste of fear on my tongue, the way the mist seemed to be reaching higher now, as if trying to climb up from the gorge to where we stood. They all turned to look at me then, expecting me to complete whatever ritual we had unknowingly begun. But I found myself backing away from the railing, every instinct screaming at me not to add my voice to whatever conversation was taking place between our world and whatever existed in that swirling darkness below. The silence stretched between us, heavy with expectation and growing dread. Marcus urged me to try, insisting that there had to be a reasonable explanation for what was happening. Danny nodded agreement, though his eyes held the wide, bright quality of someone trying very hard to convince himself of something he didn't quite believe. But I couldn't shake the feeling that calling my name down into that mist would be crossing a line from which there would be no return. The surname Ashworth rang in my ears like a bell tolling for something I couldn't name, and every fiber of my being rebelled against the idea of claiming it as my own, even by proxy. As we stood there in indecision, the mist below began to take on a more solid appearance, forming shapes that were almost human but not quite right. The proportions were wrong, the movements too fluid, as if whatever was down there was wearing the form of humanity like an ill-fitting garment. The bridge began to sway slightly, though there was no wind to account for the movement. The groaning of the old wood took on a different quality, less like the settling of aged timber and more like the sound of something breathing, something alive and aware of our presence. I found myself backing further away from the railings, pulling my friends with me toward what I hoped was the safety of solid ground. But as we moved, I realized with growing horror that I couldn't remember which direction we had come from. The bridge stretched away from us in both directions, disappearing into a mist that had somehow risen to our level, obscuring the approaches that should have led back to familiar territory. The shapes in the fog were becoming more distinct now, more purposeful in their movements. They seemed to be climbing, rising from whatever depths they had inhabited, drawn perhaps by our voices or our presence, or the very fact that we had somehow called them into being by speaking names that weren't ours to claim. Marcus grabbed my arm, his grip tight with desperation, urging me to say something, to do something that might break the spell we had apparently cast. But I found myself frozen, paralyzed by the certainty that whatever was happening to us was far beyond our understanding or control. The mist had reached the level of the bridge now, swirling around our feet like seeking fingers. It was warm, I realized with surprise, much warmer than the chill night air, and it seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, its own life. The shapes within it were more solid now, more present, and I could almost make out faces in the swirling gray. Faces that might have been human once but had been changed by whatever force existed in the depths of the gorge. Then I heard it. My own name, called from somewhere within the mist, though none of my friends had spoken. The voice was my own, but not my own, familiar yet alien, and it was followed by that same surname that had claimed each of my friends in turn. The echo had found me without my permission, without my voice to guide it, and as it spoke my name with that impossible addition, I felt something fundamental shift inside me, as if some essential part of who I was had been altered by the very act of hearing it. The mist began to recede then, sinking back toward the creek below, taking with it the shapes and shadows that had risen to meet us. But as it withdrew, I realized with growing horror that I couldn't remember my actual surname anymore. The name Ashworth filled that space in my memory completely, as if it had always been mine, as if the person I had been before setting foot on this bridge was nothing more than a half-remembered dream. My friends were staring at me with expressions I couldn't read, their faces seeming somehow unfamiliar despite having known them for years. When Danny spoke, asking if I was all right, his voice sounded different too, as if it was coming from somewhere far away, or being filtered through something that changed its very nature. We made our way off the bridge eventually, though I can't recall the journey with any clarity. What I remember is the feeling of walking through a world that had been subtly but irrevocably altered, where the familiar landmarks of my life had been shifted just enough to make everything feel foreign and strange. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that it had all been the product of too much alcohol and too active an imagination. But the name Ashworth had lodged itself in my mind like a splinter, and no amount of rational thought could dislodge it. Worse still, I began to find evidence of its presence in my life. Documents and identification that bore the surname I was certain I had never owned. Friends and family who insisted they had always known me by that name. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, I can still hear that voice calling from the mist, claiming me with a name that doesn't belong to me but has somehow become mine. And I wonder if somewhere in the darkness below that old wooden bridge, there's someone else standing at a railing, calling out their name and receiving in return the echo of who I used to be. The bridge still stands, and sometimes I drive past it on my way to work or to run errands in town. But I never stop, and I never look too closely at the mist that rises from Miller's Creek in the early morning hours. Because I'm afraid of what I might see there, afraid of what might be looking back at me from depths that exist in the spaces between what is and what should never be. And late at night, when the world is quiet, and the boundary between dream and reality grows thin, I sometimes catch myself wondering who I really am, and whether the person I remember being before that night on the bridge ever existed at all. Story 2. The Whitmore State Hospital had been closed for 37 years when I first walked through its converted entrance, now bearing a polished brass plaque that read, Museum of Mental Health History. The October rain drummed against the Gothic windows, each drop like a fingertip tapping against glass, as if something outside wanted in, or something inside wanted out. I adjusted my intern badge and checked my watch. 3:15. Dr. Brennan had given me until 6 to complete my research on early electroconvulsive therapy practices for my thesis. The museum director, a skeletal woman with wire-rimmed glasses, had handed me a set of keys and directions to the basement archives with the enthusiasm of someone disposing of medical waste. The lobby retained its institutional bones beneath the museum's cosmetic renovations. Terrazzo floors stretched endlessly, their surface worn smooth by decades of shuffling feet. The walls had been painted a cheerful yellow, but underneath, I could see the ghosts of old paint, institutional green bleeding through like bruises. The smell lingered too. Industrial disinfectant couldn't quite mask the deeper odors of decades of human suffering, fear, and confinement. I descended the main staircase, my footsteps echoing in the hollow space. The basement archives were located in what had once been the hydrotherapy wing, where patients had been subjected to ice baths and high-pressure water treatments. The hallway stretched before me, lit by harsh fluorescent bulbs that flickered sporadically, casting dancing shadows on the walls. It was here, as I reached for the steel handrail to steady myself on the uneven steps, that I first noticed the elevator. The building had 4 passenger elevators, all of which had been decommissioned when the hospital closed. Their doors were sealed with metal plates welded shut, and prominent signs warned against their use. Yet as my palm touched the cold steel of the handrail, I heard the distinct mechanical wheeze of elevator machinery groaning to life. I paused, listening. The sound came again. Cables moving, gears turning, the soft ding of floors being passed. I followed the sound to the nearest elevator shaft and pressed my ear against the sealed doors. The car was definitely moving, descending with deliberate purpose. When it stopped, silence returned so abruptly that I questioned whether I had heard anything at all. The archives were a maze of filing cabinets and storage boxes, illuminated by a single bare bulb that swayed gently in the ventilation current. I settled at a metal desk and began sorting through patient files from the 1940s and 50s, taking notes on treatment protocols and outcomes. The work was methodical, almost meditative, and I lost myself in the clinical language that reduced human suffering to neat categories and numbered procedures. It was nearly 5 o'clock when I became aware that I was no longer alone. The feeling crept over me gradually, like cold water rising around my ankles. The sensation of being watched was so strong that I looked up from my work, expecting to see the museum director or a security guard. Instead, I saw nothing but shadows and the weak glow of the exit sign at the far end of the hallway. But something was there. I couldn't see it clearly, just a shape in my peripheral vision, a figure standing motionless in the darkness beyond the archive room's entrance. When I turned my head to look directly, it seemed to melt back into the shadows, leaving only the suggestion of movement and the faint sound of fabric rustling. I convinced myself it was paranoia, brought on by spending too much time in a place where so many people had lost their grip on reality. The mind, I told myself, was susceptible to suggestion, especially in environments associated with mental illness. I returned to my work, but my concentration was broken. Every few minutes I found myself glancing up, scanning the shadows for movement. The figure appeared again as I was packing up my notes. This time, I forced myself to look directly at it, to confront whatever trick my mind was playing. What I saw made my mouth go dry. It was definitely human in shape, but wrong in every detail. The figure wore what appeared to be a dark hooded garment, but where a face should have been, there was only an empty void. Not darkness, absence, as if someone had cut a hole in reality itself. The figure stood perfectly still, and when I counted the distance between us, I realized it was exactly 20 steps away. I blinked, and it was gone. My hands shook as I gathered my materials. The rational part of my mind cataloged possible explanations: fatigue, eye strain, the power of suggestion. The basement of a former mental hospital was exactly the kind of place where imagination could run wild. But as I climbed the stairs toward the exit, my fingers trailing along the steel handrail for support, the elevator machinery groaned to life again. This time, I was certain. The sound was unmistakable, cables moving, the car descending through its shaft with mechanical precision. I stopped climbing and listened as the elevator car passed floor after floor, heading down into the depths of the building. When it stopped, the silence that followed felt pregnant with possibility. Over the next 3 days, I returned to the museum to continue my research. Each visit brought new encounters with the hooded figure. It appeared in my peripheral vision, always at the same distance, never moving closer or farther away. 20 steps. I began to measure the distance obsessively, pacing it off whenever I spotted the figure. 20 steps exactly, every time. The elevator incidents became more frequent. Every time I touched the steel handrail, whether on the main staircase, the fire escape, or the basement steps, the dead elevators would respond. The sounds were always the same: the mechanical groan of awakening machinery, the steady descent, the final stop somewhere below the basement level where no floors were supposed to exist. I researched the building's history more thoroughly, diving into architectural plans and maintenance records. The original blueprints showed only 3 basement levels, but the elevator sounds suggested the car was traveling much deeper. I found references to a sub-basement level that had been sealed in 1963, but no explanation for why. Sleep became elusive. I would lie in my apartment, listening to the night sounds of the city, and imagine I could hear the distant groaning of elevator machinery. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked increasingly haggard, and I caught myself checking over my shoulder constantly, even in my own home. On my 5th visit to the museum, I decided to test my sanity. I brought a digital camera and a voice recorder, determined to document whatever was happening to me. If I was losing my mind, at least I would have evidence of the process. The hooded figure appeared within minutes of my arrival in the archives. I raised the camera and took several photographs, the flash briefly illuminating the empty hallway. When I reviewed the images on the camera's display, they showed nothing but shadows and filing cabinets. The figure remained visible to my naked eye, standing motionless in its usual position, but the camera saw only emptiness. I spoke aloud, describing what I was seeing for the voice recorder. My voice sounded strange in the empty space, too loud and too clear. I described the figure's position, its lack of facial features, the way it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When I played back the recording, my voice was there, but the description sounded like the ravings of someone losing their grip on reality. The elevator incident that followed was the most disturbing yet. As I touched the handrail to ascend from the basement, not only did the machinery start up, but I could swear I heard something else. The sound of doors opening and closing, as if someone, or something, was getting on or off the elevator as it made its impossible journey. I began to research the hospital's patient records more specifically, looking for patterns that might explain what I was experiencing. What I found chilled me more than any supernatural explanation could have. In 1962, a patient named Marcus Holloway had been subjected to an experimental treatment involving sensory deprivation and electroshock therapy. The treatment had been designed to reset his perception of reality, to cure him of what doctors labeled as persistent hallucinations. Holloway had claimed that he was being followed by a figure without a face, a presence that maintained a constant distance of exactly 20 steps. The treatment had been a failure. Holloway's condition had worsened, and he had become convinced that the figure was not a hallucination, but something real that only he could see. He had died during the final treatment session, not from the electroshock therapy itself, but from what the records described as acute cardiac arrest brought on by extreme psychological distress. After Holloway's death, several staff members had reported strange incidents in the building. Elevators operating without power, shadows that moved independently of their sources, the sound of footsteps following them through empty corridors, always maintaining the same distance. The hospital had sealed the sub-basement level where Holloway's treatments had taken place, claiming it was due to structural concerns. The sealed elevator access was the only way to reach that floor. As I read Holloway's file, the temperature in the archive room seemed to drop several degrees. I looked up from the papers to find the hooded figure standing closer than ever before, not 20 steps away, but perhaps 15. For the first time, it seemed to be looking directly at me, though I still couldn't make out any features beneath the hood. I tried to stand, to back away, but found my legs wouldn't respond. The figure began to move, not walking but gliding across the floor with fluid motion. As it approached, I could smell something cold and metallic, like the interior of a morgue. 12 steps. 10. 8. The lights went out. In the darkness, I heard my own voice speaking words I wasn't choosing to say, describing the approach of something that shouldn't exist. The voice recorder was still running, documenting my descent into madness, or my encounter with something far worse than insanity. When the lights flickered back on, I was alone. The hooded figure was gone, but the patient file in my hands had changed. Where Marcus Holloway's name had been, I now saw my own name typed in the same typeface, dated yesterday. The diagnosis read, persistent hallucinations, probable cause, exposure to environmental triggers in former treatment facility. I dropped the file and ran from the archives, taking the stairs 3 at a time. Behind me, I could hear the elevator machinery starting up again, but this time it sounded different. Not mechanical, but almost organic, like breathing. The sound followed me up the stairs, through the lobby, and out into the October rain. As I reached my car, I looked back at the museum. In one of the upper windows, I could see a dark figure watching me. Even at this distance, I knew it was exactly 20 steps from where I had been standing inside the building. I never returned to complete my research. My thesis advisor accepted my explanation that the archives were incomplete and assigned me a different topic. But sometimes, when I'm walking down a hallway or climbing a staircase, I hear the sound of elevator machinery groaning to life behind sealed doors. And sometimes, just at the edge of my vision, I catch a glimpse of a dark hood maintaining its eternal distance. The question that haunts me isn't whether Marcus Holloway died from his delusions or from something real that had been following him. The question is whether the treatment was designed to cure his hallucinations or to make him stop seeing something that was actually there. I've counted the steps from my apartment door to the elevator in my building. 20 steps exactly. The elevator has been out of order for 3 days now, but I still hear it running at night. Story 3. The industrial hum of the restaurant's ventilation system had become my lullaby over the past 18 months. Working as sous chef at Meridian meant 12-hour shifts that bled into one another, the line between day and night dissolving in the fluorescent glare of the kitchen. The break room, what we generously called the Copa, was my only sanctuary, a cramped space tucked behind the walk-in freezer where the staff could grab 5 minutes of peace between the dinner rush chaos. That Tuesday evening started like any other. The autumn rain hammered against the restaurant's windows, creating a steady percussion that mixed with the clatter of plates and the sharp bark of orders from the pass. My hands moved automatically through the familiar motions, julienning carrots, checking sauce consistency, calling out ticket times, while my mind wandered to the growing pile of bills on my kitchen counter at home. The promotion to head chef seemed perpetually just out of reach, dangling like a carrot I could never quite grasp. During the brief lull between prep and service, I ducked into the Copa to grab a coffee. The small television mounted in the corner had been broken for weeks, its screen flickering with static whenever someone bothered to turn it on. But something compelled me to reach for the remote that evening, maybe the desire for background noise to cut through the oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. The screen flickered to life, and I expected the usual static, or maybe a local news station if we were lucky. Instead, I found myself staring at an image that made my coffee cup pause halfway to my lips. There I was, standing in the exact spot where I now stood, wearing the same stained apron, the same expression of mild confusion creasing my features. But the version of me on screen moved with a strange, mechanical quality, as if operating on a slight delay. I raised my hand to my face, and 3 seconds later, the televised version of myself did the same. My rational mind immediately supplied explanations. A security camera feed somehow crossed with the television signal, some kind of digital loop or malfunction. But as I flipped through the channels, the same impossible scene played out on every station. Channel 4, Channel 7, the local PBS affiliate, all showed me standing in the Copa, watching myself on television, trapped in an infinite regression that made my vision blur around the edges. The sensation of being observed crept up my spine like cold fingers. I spun around, expecting to find a camera mounted somewhere in the Copa. But the walls held only the usual detritus of restaurant life: employee schedules, health department notices, and a motivational poster featuring a kitten that someone had defaced with a Sharpie. No cameras, no logical explanation for what pulsed on the screen behind me. I turned back to the television. The other me, the delayed me, was also looking around the room with the same growing unease. His movements mirrored mine perfectly, but always those crucial 3 seconds behind, as if he existed in a pocket universe where time moved like honey. When I reached out to touch the screen, he reached out too, and for a moment I expected our fingertips to meet through the glass. Instead, my fingers met only the cold, static-charged surface while his hand moved through empty air. The break room door banged open, making me jump. Marcus, one of the line cooks, poked his head in. "Chef, we need you on the line. Ticket machine's going crazy." I glanced back at the screen. The delayed version of myself was still standing there, but now he was looking toward where the door would open. 3 seconds later, just as Marcus had appeared, my television doppelganger turned his head toward the entrance. The timing was perfect, terrifying, and impossible. "Yeah, I'll be right there," I managed, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. Marcus nodded and disappeared back into the controlled chaos of the kitchen. I looked at the screen one more time. The other me was alone again, but now he was reaching for something off camera. I realized with a jolt that he was turning off the television. 3 seconds later, my hand moved almost involuntarily to the power button. The screen went black. The dinner rush provided a welcome distraction, the familiar rhythm of coordinating orders and managing the line pushing the strange encounter to the back of my mind. But during quiet moments, when I paused to wipe sweat from my forehead or stepped back to survey the kitchen, I felt eyes on me. Not the usual awareness of cameras and staff, but something more intimate and invasive. Several times I caught myself glancing toward the copa, half expecting to see my own face peering out from the doorway. During the next break, I found myself drawn back to the television like a moth to flame. This time I told myself I would document what I saw, maybe record it on my phone to prove I wasn't losing my mind. The screen flickered on, and there I was again, standing in the exact same spot, holding my phone in the exact same position. The delayed me was also holding a phone, also preparing to record. I started the recording. 3 seconds later, so did he. The video captured everything. My face, the copa around me, the television screen showing myself holding a phone. But when I played it back, something was wrong. The video showed me in the copa, alone, staring at a television screen filled with static. No delayed version of myself, no impossible loop. Just a man standing in a break room, filming nothing. But I had seen it. I was still seeing it, even as the playback showed only static. The disconnect between what my eyes perceived and what the camera recorded sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the industrial air conditioning. I saved the video anyway, a piece of evidence that proved only that evidence itself couldn't be trusted. Over the following days, the phenomenon became routine. Every time I entered the copa, every time I turned on the television, there I was. 3 seconds behind, trapped in my own delayed existence. I began timing the delay, testing it with various movements and gestures. The lag never varied. Exactly 3 seconds, no matter what I did. I started avoiding the copa during busy periods, but the knowledge of the television's presence gnawed at me like a splinter. During slower moments, I found excuses to check on it, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The delayed version of myself seemed to be developing a life of its own, sometimes making slightly different movements, as if he was beginning to deviate from the script of my actions. Sleep became elusive. At home, I found myself wondering if my television there would show the same impossible scene. I couldn't bring myself to find out. Instead, I covered the screen with a blanket and tried to forget the weight of invisible eyes that seemed to follow me from room to room. The real terror began when I started seeing the delay in other places. Mirrors in the restaurant's bathroom showed my reflection a fraction of a second behind my movements. The steel surfaces of prep tables caught my image with that same mechanical delay. Even the polished side of pots and pans reflected a version of myself that lagged behind reality by those crucial 3 seconds. I mentioned it to no one. How could I explain that I was being stalked by my own delayed reflection? That every surface in the restaurant had become a window into a parallel existence where I lived 3 seconds in the past? The rational part of my mind insisted it was stress, fatigue, maybe some kind of neurological issue brought on by too many 14-hour days and too little sleep. But the rational part of my mind was losing the battle. The breaking point came during a particularly hectic Friday night service. The kitchen was in full swing, every burner occupied, every member of the team moving in the practice choreography of professional food service. I was plating a lamb dish when I caught sight of my reflection in the sauce pot's surface. There I was, 3 seconds behind, but this time I wasn't plating the same dish. The delayed me was holding a different plate, preparing different food, as if he had diverged from my timeline entirely. I dropped the plate. The crash sent sauce splattering across the floor, drawing startled looks from the line cooks. But I barely noticed. I was staring at the pot, watching the delayed version of myself continue his own separate task, oblivious to the chaos I had just caused in the real world. "Chef, you okay?" Marcus asked, already moving to clean up the mess. I nodded, not trusting my voice, but I wasn't okay. The delayed me in the pot's reflection had looked up at that moment, and for the first time, he seemed to see me too. His eyes met mine through the curved steel surface, and he smiled, an expression I hadn't made, a reaction that belonged to him alone. That night I stayed late after service, long after the last customer had left and the cleaning crew had finished their work. The restaurant felt different in the empty hours, full of shadows that seemed to move independently, and sounds that had no obvious source. I made my way to the copa with deliberate steps, my heart hammering against my ribs. The television was already on. I hadn't turned it on. I was certain I hadn't touched the remote. But there it was, glowing in the dim break room, and there I was on screen. Not delayed this time, but perfectly synchronized with my movements. When I raised my hand, so did he. When I stepped closer to the screen, so did he. We were moving in perfect unison, as if the 3-second gap had finally closed. But something was wrong with his eyes. They held an intelligence, an awareness that seemed separate from my own thoughts. When I blinked, he held his eyes open just a fraction longer. When I tilted my head, he tilted his at a slightly different angle, small deviations that grew more pronounced with each passing moment. I reached for the remote to turn off the television, but stopped when I saw that the other me was reaching for something different, something off camera that I couldn't see. His hand moved with purpose, grasping at empty air in my world, but clearly interacting with objects in his. The delayed me had become something else entirely. Not a reflection or a recording, but a separate entity living parallel to my existence, 3 seconds out of phase with reality. And now, as I watched in growing horror, he was beginning to influence the world around him in ways I couldn't predict or control. The screen flickered once, twice, then stabilized. The other me looked directly at the camera, directly at me, and mouthed words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. He was trying to tell me something urgent and important about the nature of our connection. But before I could make sense of his silent message, the screen went black. Not turned off, but black as if the signal had been cut from somewhere else entirely. In the darkness of the copa, surrounded by the industrial hum of the restaurant's overnight operations, I realized that the real question wasn't whether what I was seeing was real or imaginary. The real question was, which one of us was the original, and which one was the 3-second delay. As I stood in the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of the empty restaurant settling around me, I became acutely aware that somewhere, in a copa 3 seconds behind or ahead of mine, another version of myself was asking the exact same question, and neither of us would ever know the answer. Story 4. The moving truck had left tire marks on Uncle Robert's new driveway, fresh black scars on pristine concrete that somehow looked more permanent than temporary. I stood at the front door, my finger hovering over the doorbell, watching those marks through the corner of my eye. Something about them felt deliberate, like a signature left behind by someone who wanted to be remembered. The house itself seemed to exhale as I finally pressed the button. A hollow chime echoed somewhere deep inside, followed by the sound of footsteps that were too quick, too eager. When Robert opened the door, his smile was the kind I recognized from my advertising days, forced brightness masking something that didn't want to be seen. "Marcus, you made it." His handshake lingered a beat too long, his palm damp despite the October chill. Come in, still getting everything sorted, but the bones of the place are good." The bones. An odd way to describe a house, but as I stepped inside, the phrase felt accurate. The walls were stark white, freshly painted but somehow hollow-looking, like skin stretched too tight over a frame. Boxes labeled in Robert's precise handwriting lined the hallway. Kitchen, bedroom, office. Each word written with the careful control of someone trying to impose order on chaos. "Sorry about the mess," Robert said, though there was no mess. Just those boxes standing at attention like soldiers awaiting deployment. Moving at my age isn't what it used to be. Thought I'd have more energy, more purpose. His voice trailed off as we walked deeper into the house. The living room was spacious but felt compressed, as if the air itself had weight. A single chair sat in the center, facing away from the windows, toward the kitchen doorway. No television, no coffee table, no signs of life beyond that solitary piece of furniture positioned like a watchtower. "Minimalist phase," Robert explained when he caught me staring. "After Margaret, well, you strip things down to what matters, what you actually need." Margaret, his wife of 30 years, gone 6 months now. I'd missed the funeral, trapped in meetings about cereal commercials and car insurance taglines. The guilt had been gnawing at me since, part of why I'd driven 3 hours to visit him in this new place he'd chosen to start over. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee? Water?" Robert moved toward the kitchen, then stopped abruptly, his body tensing like a dog catching an unfamiliar scent. "Actually, maybe we should sit in here first. Get caught up." But I was already walking toward the kitchen, drawn by curiosity and something else. A subtle wrongness in the air, like the moment before a storm when animals go quiet. The kitchen was completely empty, not just of people, but of everything. No appliances, no cabinets, no dishes. Just white walls, white floor, white ceiling, and a single window that looked out onto a backyard filled with moving boxes the crew had apparently abandoned. "Haven't gotten around to setting it up yet," Robert said behind me, but his voice sounded strained. "The basics are still in boxes." I nodded, turning back toward him, when the first sound hit. Clink. Clear. Distinct. Unmistakable. The sound of ceramic meeting ceramic. A coffee mug being set down on a counter maybe, or plates being stacked. But there was nothing in the room to make such a sound. Robert's face went pale. "You heard that?" Before I could answer, it came again. Clink. Clink. 2 pieces of dishware touching, then separating. Then a softer sound, like silverware being sorted in a drawer that didn't exist. What the hell? I stepped back into the kitchen, scanning every corner, every surface. Empty. Completely empty. But the sounds continued. A symphony of domestic activity in a room devoid of anything that could create it. Robert grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in with surprising strength. "It's been happening since I moved in. Every day, same time. 3:15 in the afternoon." I checked my phone. 3:16 p.m. Clink, clink, clink. The sounds were getting more pronounced, more rhythmic. Not random kitchen noise, but something with pattern, with purpose. I pulled out my phone and opened the camera app, hitting record. The microphone would pick up whatever was causing this, some kind of settling in the pipes maybe, or vibrations from the house next door. The recording showed only an empty kitchen, silent and still. But standing there, we could both hear it clearly. Dishes moving, being arranged, cleaned, put away. The sounds of someone preparing a meal in a kitchen that had never held a meal. "Play it back," Robert whispered. I stopped recording and immediately hit play. Static. Nothing but a low, steady hiss, white noise that could have been air conditioning or electrical interference. No dishes, no movement, nothing. "That's impossible." I recorded again, this time holding the phone closer to where the sounds seemed strongest. The noise continued around us, now including what sounded like running water from a non-existent faucet. But the playback showed the same result. Silence disguised as static. "I've tried everything," Robert said, his voice barely audible above the phantom kitchen orchestra. Different phones, a digital recorder, even hired a guy with professional equipment. Same thing every time. Nothing. The sounds began to fade. like someone finishing their work and moving to another room. Within minutes, the kitchen returned to its hollow quiet, leaving only the smell of something. Not quite food, not quite cleaning products. Something organic and warm, like breath in cold air. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. "Since the first day. The movers had just left and I was standing exactly where you are now, wondering where to start unpacking when it began." Robert ran his hands through his thinning hair. "I thought it was stress, grief playing tricks, but it's too consistent, too real." We walked back to the living room, but I found myself glancing over my shoulder at the kitchen doorway. The sounds had stopped, but something else had replaced them, a feeling of being observed. Not by Robert, but by something in that empty room, something that had just finished its daily routine and was now watching us discuss it. "Have you talked to the previous owners?" I asked, settling into the chair's companion, a folding chair Robert had apparently brought from his old place. "Family estate sale. Old woman lived here alone for 40 years after her husband died. The neighbors said she used to cook elaborate meals right up until the end, even though she ate alone." Robert's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "They found her in the kitchen. Natural causes, they said. Peaceful." The afternoon light was shifting, casting long shadows through the windows. I found myself listening for sounds from the kitchen, but it remained quiet. The kind of quiet that feels temporary, like an intermission rather than an ending. "Show me the recording again," Robert said. "But slow it down, way down." I pulled up the video and accessed the editing features, sliding the playback speed to its lowest setting. The static hiss deepened, becoming almost melodic, and underneath it, thump, thump, thump. Rhythmic, steady, unmistakable, not dishes at all, but something far more disturbing. A heartbeat, strong and consistent, echoing through the white noise at exactly the tempo of my own pulse. Jesus Christ. I let the phone drop to my lap, my own heart suddenly thundering in my chest. "That's not possible." Robert leaned forward, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and vindication. "You hear it too, don't you? It's not just the kitchen sounds. There's something else, something underneath." I played it again, counting the beats. 68 per minute, exactly matching the rhythm I could feel in my temples, in my wrists, in the hollow of my throat. As if the recording had somehow captured not the sounds of an empty room, but the very pulse of whoever was listening. "It's my heartbeat," I whispered. "It's recording my heartbeat." "No," Robert said quietly. "It's recording hers." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I looked around, suddenly hyper-aware of every shadow, every corner where someone might be standing just out of sight. The feeling of being watched had intensified, no longer coming from the kitchen but from everywhere at once. The walls, the ceiling, the space between my shoulder blades. Whose heartbeat? But even as I asked, I knew he meant the old woman, the one who had died in the kitchen, who had spent 40 years cooking alone in that empty white room. I've timed it every day since I moved in. Same rhythm, same strength. Sometimes it matches mine, sometimes it doesn't. But it's always there, underneath the other sounds. Like she's still... He gestured helplessly toward the kitchen. Like she's still here, still living her routine. I stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, the abandoned moving boxes sat in the fading daylight like tombstones in a neglected cemetery. The rational part of my mind, the part trained to sell products and solve problems, scrambled for explanations. Audio compression artifacts, electromagnetic interference, some kind of feedback loop between the phone's microphone and speaker. But my body knew better. My heart was racing now, no longer matching the rhythm from the recording but fighting against it, like two metronomes trying to synchronize. The feeling of being watched had become so intense that I couldn't stand still, couldn't focus on any one spot without feeling eyes boring into my back. "You have to leave this place," I told Robert. "This isn't healthy. This isn't normal." "Where would I go?" His voice was smaller now, older. This is what I can afford. This is what's left. I turned back to face him and froze. Robert was sitting perfectly still in his chair, but his lips were moving silently, forming words I couldn't hear. His eyes were fixed on something behind me, something in the kitchen doorway, and his expression was one of recognition. Not fear, but familiarity, like greeting an old friend. Slowly, I turned around. The kitchen doorway was empty, but the air in front of it shimmered slightly, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. And underneath the growing dusk, I could swear I heard breathing, not Robert's, not mine, but something else, something patient and steady, keeping time with that recorded heartbeat still echoing in my mind. "She's not trying to scare us," Robert said, his voice distant and dreamy. "She's just continuing. Same time every day, same routine. She doesn't know she's gone." The shimmer in the doorway seemed to pulse, growing stronger and then fainter, like a signal trying to tune itself in. I backed toward the front door, my rational mind finally surrendering to the primal urge to run. But Robert remained seated, calm now in a way that was more frightening than his earlier fear. "You could stay for dinner," he said conversationally. "She always makes enough for two." I was at the front door now, my hand on the knob, when the kitchen sounds started again, but this time they were different. Not the careful, solitary sounds of someone working alone, but the bustling activity of someone preparing a meal for guests. Multiple plates being set out, silverware for two, the scrape of chairs being arranged around a table that didn't exist. The shimmer in the doorway had resolved into something almost solid now, a presence that seemed to be looking back and forth between Robert and me, as if trying to decide how much to set the table for. "I have to go," I managed, turning the doorknob. "Of course," Robert said pleasantly. "But you'll come back, won't you? She likes having company. We both do." I stepped outside into the cool evening air, my heart hammering against my ribs. Behind me, the sounds from the kitchen continued, now clearly the noise of a dinner being prepared, complete with the soft murmur of conversation between voices I couldn't quite make out. I didn't run to my car, but I didn't walk slowly either. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced back at the house. Robert was visible through the living room window, no longer alone in his chair. The space beside him wasn't empty anymore. Something was sitting there, something that cast just enough of a shadow to be noticed, but not enough to be defined. I drove for 20 minutes before I realized I was still holding my breath. The recording is still on my phone. I've listened to it dozens of times since that day, always with the speed turned down, always hearing that steady heartbeat underneath the static. Some nights when I'm lying in bed trying to sleep, I swear I can feel it. Not just hear it, but feel it in my chest, as if something is trying to synchronize my pulse with its own. I called Robert the next day, and the day after that. The phone rings 4 times and goes to voicemail, but sometimes, if I listen carefully to the background noise, I can hear them. The sounds of dishes being washed, a table being set, quiet conversation over a meal that shouldn't exist. I haven't driven back to check on him. I tell myself it's because I'm busy, because the 3-hour drive isn't practical, because he seemed happy in that final moment when I saw him through the window. But the truth is simpler and more disturbing. I'm afraid of what I might find. I'm afraid I'll arrive at 3:15 in the afternoon and hear my own heartbeat echoing from that empty kitchen, calling me to stay for dinner at a table set for 3. And I'm afraid that this time, I might say yes. Story 5. The sound came first, a dull thud that pulled me from the depths of sleep like a fishing hook dragging through murky water. My studio apartment, barely larger than a generous closet, amplified every noise. The building was old, constructed when privacy meant something different, when walls were suggestions rather than barriers. I'd grown accustomed to the symphony of urban living, Mrs. Chen's television bleeding through the thin drywall, the couple upstairs whose arguments crescendoed at precisely 2:30 each morning, the subway rumbling beneath us like some mechanical leviathan digesting the city's bones. But this sound was different, immediate, intimate. It resembled the gallop of something large moving on four legs, rapid, purposeful strikes against the hardwood floor beside my bed. The rhythm was too deliberate to be settling pipes, too heavy to be rodents. My eyes remained closed, that peculiar stubbornness of the recently awakened refusing to acknowledge consciousness, but my other senses sharpened with predatory focus. The air in the room felt different, thicker, as if something massive had displaced the normal oxygen content, leaving behind a humid weight that pressed against my skin. The familiar scent of my apartment, coffee grounds, old books, the faint staleness of infrequent cleaning, had been contaminated by something else. Something organic and wild, like wet fur and earth after rainfall. My eyelids fluttered open against my better judgment. The shadow stood where no shadow should exist. Beside my bed, perhaps 3 feet from where I lay, a darkness had taken shape that defied every law of physics I'd learned in my undergraduate years. It rose from the floor in a configuration that hurt to comprehend. An elongated mass that should have been horizontal, positioned on 4 legs like every mammal I'd ever encountered, but instead stretched upward in a vertical column that bent at an angle that seemed to mock the very concept of spinal structure. The thing was tall, taller than any person had a right to be in a room with 8-foot ceilings. Its uppermost portion, what I assumed must be a head, though it bore no recognizable features, nearly touched the water-stained plaster above. The middle section twisted in a way that suggested broken bones healing incorrectly, creating a helical spiral that made my vision blur when I tried to follow its contours. I held my breath, every muscle in my body locked in paralysis that felt both voluntary and imposed. The shadow remained motionless, as if it too was waiting, though for what I couldn't fathom. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Time had become elastic in that small room, stretching and contracting according to the rhythm of my thundering heartbeat. Then it moved. Not walked, not stepped. Moved. The entire form shifted slightly to the left, maintaining its impossible vertical orientation while seeming to flow rather than reposition. The sound that accompanied this movement was wrong in ways I struggled to articulate even to myself. It was wet and dry simultaneously, like leather being slowly peeled from damp stone, combined with the subtle crackling of joints adjusting under immense pressure. My rational mind, the part that had earned a master's degree in engineering, that understood load-bearing calculations and structural integrity, scrambled for explanations. A coat hanging on the back of my chair, distorted by sleep-addled perception, and the orange streetlight filtering through my single window. A trick of shadows created by the building's exterior architecture. The lingering fragments of a dream bleeding into consciousness. But my body knew better. My skin had erupted in goosebumps that had nothing to do with temperature. The fine hairs on my arms and neck stood at attention like soldiers preparing for an assault they couldn't see coming. Every primitive instinct inherited from ancestors who survived by recognizing when they were being hunted screamed that I was no longer alone in my sanctuary. The shadow turned what might have been its head toward me. I clamped my eyes shut with such force that phosphonies exploded across the darkness behind my lids. Brilliant bursts of false light that painted nonsensical patterns in my visual cortex. The childish logic that claimed monsters couldn't hurt you if you couldn't see them took control, despite my adult understanding of its absurdity. But closing my eyes only heightened my other senses. I could hear something that might have been breathing, if breathing involved multiple chambers inflating and deflating in sequence, creating a subtle wheeze that reminded me of old bellows working air through a fireplace. The sound was too complex for human lungs, too rhythmic to be mechanical. Worse still was the smell that had intensified during my moment of visual denial. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was utterly foreign, like nothing I'd encountered in 32 years of urban existence. It carried notes of wilderness that had no business in a 4th-floor apartment, pine needles and moss, wet earth and something that might have been musk if musk could develop cancerous growths. I forced my eyes open again, driven by the same compulsion that makes people stare at automobile accidents. The shadow had moved closer. Now it loomed directly over my bed, positioned where someone might stand if they were examining a sleeping form with scientific curiosity. The twisted middle section of its body swayed slightly, as if it were fighting against gravity. or perhaps conducting some internal debate about its next action. My throat had constricted to the diameter of a drinking straw, making each breath a conscious effort that produced a faint wheeze. I wanted to speak, to demand an explanation or beg for mercy, but my vocal cords had apparently declared independence from my central nervous system. Instead, I lay frozen beneath my thin blanket, watching this impossible geometry of darkness study me with what I assumed was focused attention. The thing's head, or the region I had designated as its head, tilted at an angle that would have snapped a human neck. The movement was slow, deliberate, like a dog hearing a sound that existed just beyond the range of human perception. For a terrifying moment, I wondered if it was responding to something else in the room, something I couldn't detect but that posed an even greater threat than the shadow itself. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. They were unmistakably human, the familiar rhythm of someone climbing stairs after a long day, accompanied by the jingle of keys and the soft curse that followed dropping something. My neighbor, probably. Sarah from 4B, returning from her bartending shift at the place downtown that stayed open until 3. The shadow's attention shifted toward my door with predatory focus. Its entire form seemed tense, though I couldn't identify specific muscles or anatomical features that would account for this impression. It was more like watching a spider prepare to pounce, where the change in posture communicated deadly intent through mechanisms that bypassed rational analysis. The footsteps stopped directly outside my door. For several heartbeats, the only sound was my own breathing, shallow, rapid inhalations that I tried unsuccessfully to quiet. The shadow remained motionless, angled toward the door like a hunting dog pointing at hidden prey. Then I heard Sarah's key sliding into her lock, followed by the familiar squeak of her door opening and closing. Her apartment was silent after that, leaving me alone again with my impossible visitor. But when I turned back to examine the shadow, it was gone. The space beside my bed was empty, filled only with the mundane darkness that belonged in a small apartment at 3 in the morning. The air had returned to its normal composition, stale but breathable, carrying the familiar sense of my confined existence. The oppressive weight that had pressed against my skin had lifted, leaving behind only the memory of its presence. I sat up in bed, my muscles protesting after their extended period of paralysis. The movement felt strange, as if I were relearning how to control my own body. I reached for the lamp on my nightstand, my fingers trembling as they found the switch. Yellow light flooded the room, revealing the mundane reality of my studio apartment. My desk chair sat empty in its usual position. No coat hung from its back. I'd forgotten that my jacket was in the laundry basket beside my dresser. The floor showed no evidence of any visitor, impossible or otherwise. The window remained closed and locked, its glass reflecting my own pale face back at me like an accusation. I remained awake until dawn, sitting upright in bed with the lamp illuminated, studying every corner of my small domain for signs of intrusion or disturbance. But the apartment revealed nothing unusual, nothing that couldn't be explained by normal wear and the accumulated debris of solitary living. When morning arrived, painting my single window with gray light filtered through urban smog, I almost convinced myself that the entire episode had been a particularly vivid nightmare. The mind, I reminded myself, was capable of extraordinary deceptions, especially during the transitional moments between sleep and consciousness. Hypnagogic hallucinations were well-documented phenomena. Sleep paralysis could create sensory experiences that felt absolutely real to the person experiencing them. I showered, made coffee, and prepared for another day at the engineering firm where I spent my waking hours calculating the load-bearing capacity of structures designed to shelter human beings from the elements and whatever else might lurk beyond the walls. But as I was leaving for work, I noticed something that made my hand freeze on the doorknob. 4 distinct marks on the hardwood floor beside my bed. Deep gouges in the wood that arranged themselves in a pattern that could have been made by claws, or hooves, or something that combined characteristics of both in a configuration that had no name in any zoological taxonomy I knew. The marks were fresh. The exposed wood was lighter than the surrounding floor, indicating that whatever had created them had done so recently. Very recently. I knelt beside the gouges, running my finger along their edges. They were too deep to have been made by furniture legs, too precisely arranged to be the result of normal wear. Their spacing suggested something large, larger than any domestic animal that might have wandered into a fourth-floor apartment, through means I couldn't begin to imagine. Standing up, I examined my apartment again with different eyes. The single window remained locked from the inside. The door showed no signs of forced entry. The fire escape outside my window was accessible only to residents of the upper floors, and it would have required considerable effort to reach my apartment from that direction. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Something had been in my room during the night. Something had left physical proof of its presence in the form of marks that would cost me most of my security deposit to repair. I called in sick to work that day, spending the time researching urban wildlife, break-in statistics, and the structural integrity of old apartment buildings. I examined every possible conventional explanation for what I had experienced, following each thread of logic until it led to an inevitable dead end. By evening, I had convinced myself that some rational explanation existed, even if I couldn't identify it immediately. Perhaps a maintenance worker had been in my apartment the previous day, moving furniture in a way that created the marks. Perhaps my memory of the shadow was a false reconstruction, my brain's attempt to create a narrative that explained the strange sounds and sensations I had experienced during a particularly vivid dream. But as darkness settled over the city again, my confidence began to erode. I prepared for sleep with the meticulous care of someone expecting visitors. I checked the locks on my door and window multiple times. I positioned my furniture so that nothing could cast shadows in the configuration I remembered from the previous night. I even went so far as to place a small digital camera on my dresser, aimed at the space beside my bed, though I wasn't entirely certain I wanted to see whatever it might record. Sleep came reluctantly, interrupted by every sound from the building's normal nocturnal symphony. Each time I drifted toward unconsciousness, some noise would pull me back. The building settling, pipes expanding with temperature changes, the distant rumble of late-night traffic. But eventually, exhaustion overcame vigilance. I woke to the same dull thud. This time, I kept my eyes closed, but I could feel its presence immediately. The air pressure had changed again, becoming thick and humid despite the fact that my apartment's heating system barely functioned during the best of circumstances. The smell had returned as well, that impossible combination of wilderness scents that had no business existing in an urban environment. The thing was closer now. I could sense its proximity without seeing it, the way you might feel someone standing too near during a crowded subway ride. My skin prickled with the certainty that I was being observed, studied, perhaps catalogued for some purpose I couldn't comprehend. I forced myself to remain motionless, to continue the steady breathing pattern of deep sleep while my heart hammered against my ribcage with enough force to shake my entire body. Minutes passed in this state of suspended animation, predator and prey, locked in a dance where the rules remained unclear to one of the participants. Then I felt something that made every rational thought in my head scatter like startled birds. Breath against my face. It was warm and humid, carrying that alien scent directly into my nostrils and lungs. The rhythm was wrong. Too slow for a human, too complex for any animal I could identify. Each exhalation seemed to emerge from multiple sources, as if several beings were breathing in careful coordination just inches from my face. My eyes snapped open involuntarily. The shadow's head hovered directly above mine, close enough that I could have reached up and touched whatever passed for its features, if I'd possessed the courage or the madness required for such an action. In the darkness, I could make out no details of its construction, only the sense of vast size and wrongness that accompanied its presence. We stared at each other, or at least I stared while it presumably observed me through whatever sensory organs it possessed. The moment stretched between us like a tightrope over an abyss, fragile and balanced on the edge of some transition that would change everything. Then it spoke, not with words exactly. The sound that emerged from somewhere within its twisted form was too complex for human language, too organic for any artificial communication system. It was something between a whisper and a growl, a wet sound that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly within my skull. But somehow, impossibly, I understood its meaning. You see me now. The words formed in my mind without passing through my auditory system, arriving as fully formed concepts that carried emotional weight far beyond their simple content. There was satisfaction in the communication, and something that might have been approval, as if I had passed some test that I hadn't known I was taking. Good. We can begin. My mouth opened to respond, to ask the questions that crowded my throat like prisoners fighting for freedom. But the shadow was already moving. It flowed backward, maintaining its impossible vertical orientation while somehow conveying the impression of retreat. Within seconds, it had repositioned itself in the corner of my room, where it stood motionless in a space that should have been too small to accommodate something of its apparent size. I lay in bed, staring at this new arrangement, my mind cycling through explanations and rejecting each one with increasing desperation. The shadow remained in the corner until dawn, a presence that I could feel even when I wasn't looking directly at it, like a weight pressing against the edge of my peripheral vision. When morning light finally penetrated my window, the shadow didn't disappear gradually the way normal darkness retreated before the sun. Instead, it simply ceased to exist between one moment and the next, leaving behind only the familiar geometry of my corner where a filing cabinet stood next to a small bookshelf. But something had changed. The apartment felt different now, not invaded exactly, but altered in some fundamental way that I couldn't articulate. It was as if the space had been marked, claimed, designated for a purpose that remained unclear, but carried implications that made my skin crawl with anticipatory dread. The camera I had positioned the previous evening showed nothing unusual when I reviewed its footage. 8 hours of static recording revealed only an empty room with normal shadows cast by normal furniture. Yet I knew with absolute certainty that something had been present, something that either existed outside the electromagnetic spectrum that digital sensors could detect or possessed the ability to edit its presence from recorded media. Over the following days, the visits became routine. Each night the shadow would return, taking up its position first beside my bed, then retreating to the corner where it would remain until dawn. Our interaction was limited to that single exchange. You see me now. We can begin. But I could feel it studying me with each visit, gathering information for some purpose that remained frustratingly opaque. I stopped sleeping entirely for 3 days, surviving on coffee and the kind of artificial alertness that comes from pushing human physiology beyond its designed limits. But exhaustion eventually claimed victory, and I would wake to find the shadow in its usual position, watching me with what I had come to interpret as patient persistence. My work performance deteriorated rapidly. Colleagues began commenting on my appearance, the dark circles under my eyes, the nervous habits I'd developed, the way I would stop mid-sentence and stare at corners of rooms where shadows gathered in perfectly normal configurations. I started taking long lunch breaks, using the time to research urban legends, paranormal phenomena, and the documented cases of shared psychotic episodes that might explain what was happening to me. But deep down, beneath the layers of rationalization and desperate searching for conventional explanations, I knew that what I was experiencing transcended the categories that human knowledge had established for understanding reality. The shadow was real. It existed in some form that operated according to rules I didn't understand, serving purposes that remained hidden from my limited perspective. And somehow, I had become part of whatever process it was conducting in my small apartment. 3 weeks after the first encounter, the nature of our relationship changed again. I woke not to the familiar thud, but to the sensation of being gently shaken. My eyes opened to find the shadow's head positioned close to mine, one appendage that might have been an arm or a tentacle resting on my shoulder with surprising gentleness. Time to go, it communicated, the concepts arriving in my mind with the same direct clarity as before. Without conscious decision, I found myself sitting up and then standing beside my bed. My body moved with a fluidity that felt alien, as if someone else was operating my nervous system, while I observed from a passenger seat in my own skull. The shadow stepped back to give me room, then gestured toward my apartment door with a limb that changed shape as I watched, flowing from something resembling an arm to a configuration that had more in common with a snake, or perhaps a length of rope made from living tissue. I walked to the door, my bare feet making no sound on the hardwood floor. My hand turned the deadbolt and opened the door without any input from my conscious mind. The hallway beyond was dark and empty, lit only by the emergency exit sign at the far end. But as I stepped into the corridor, I realized that the building had changed. The familiar walls were still present, but they stretched far higher than the building's actual architecture would allow. The ceiling had become a distant suggestion somewhere in the darkness above, and the hallway extended much further in both directions than the physical structure could accommodate. Other shadows moved in this expanded space, tall, vertical forms that maintained the same impossible geometry as my nightly visitor. They stood in doorways that belonged to apartments I knew didn't exist, positioned at intervals along a corridor that had somehow grown to accommodate them. My shadow guide moved behind me, its presence a gentle pressure against my back that encouraged forward movement. We walked together down this transformed hallway, passing dozens of the vertical beings who turned their attention toward me as I passed. I could feel their observation-like weight settling on my skin, not hostile but intensely curious, as if I were a novel specimen being examined by experts in a field I couldn't comprehend. At the end of the corridor, where there should have been a wall containing the stairwell access, a door stood open. Beyond it lay not the familiar staircase, but a space that my mind refused to properly process. It was simultaneously vast and intimate, filled with a soft light that seemed to emerge from no identifiable source. My guide paused at the threshold, turning its head toward me in what I interpreted as an invitation. The communication that followed was more complex than our previous exchanges, carrying layers of meaning that my conscious mind struggled to unpack. This is where you learn what you are becoming. This is where we show you what has always been true. This is where you choose whether to return to the small room and the small life, or to understand the larger pattern of which you have always been a part. I stood at the threshold, my bare feet on the cold floor of a corridor that couldn't exist in a building I thought I knew, facing a choice between worlds that my education had never prepared me to recognize. Behind me lay my studio apartment with its familiar constraints and reliable limitations. Ahead lay something that challenged every assumption I had made about the nature of reality, offering knowledge that would transform my understanding of existence in ways that felt both terrifying and necessary. The shadow waited with infinite patience for my decision, while around us, the other vertical beings maintained their silent observation. Time seemed suspended in that impossible hallway, stretching to accommodate the weight of the choice before me. I looked back once at the space I had called home, then stepped forward into the light, leaving behind the person I had been for 32 years and embracing whatever I was meant to become. The door closed behind me with a sound like thunder, or perhaps like the beating of enormous wings. When the police found my apartment 3 days later, responding to complaints about a smell coming from 4A, they discovered a space that showed no signs of struggle or disturbance. My personal belongings remained exactly where I had left them. The bed was unmade, as if I had simply risen one morning and walked away from my life. The only unusual detail was a series of marks on the hardwood floor beside the bed. 4 deep gouges that formed a pattern the investigating officers couldn't explain. Their report noted the marks as possible evidence of an animal presence, though no animal hairs or other biological traces were discovered anywhere in the apartment. My disappearance was filed as a missing person case that generated brief local media attention before fading into the statistical background noise of urban life. Friends and colleagues offered theories about stress-induced breakdown, financial difficulties, or a planned escape from responsibilities that had become overwhelming. But sometimes, in the early hours before dawn, residents of the building report hearing footsteps in the 4th floor hallway. They describe the sound of multiple individuals walking together, their pace measured and purposeful, moving toward the stairwell that leads to floors that shouldn't exist in a building of that height. The apartment remains empty, though prospective tenants occasionally inquire about the rental. Most lose interest after viewing the space, citing concerns about the lighting or the strange marks on the floor that the building's maintenance staff has been unable to sand away. A few, however, sign the lease despite these minor imperfections. They move in with enthusiasm, attracted by the affordable rent and the apartment's proximity to downtown amenities. And sometimes, after they've been living there for a few weeks, Other residents notice that these new tenants begin to look tired. They develop dark circles under their eyes and nervous habits, involving the examination of corners where shadows gather. Their friends comment on their distracted behavior and their tendency to stare at empty spaces as if something invisible commands their attention. Then, one morning, their apartments are found empty, with no signs of struggle or disturbance. Only those same 4 marks on the hardwood floor, as if something large had stood beside the bed, waiting patiently for its tenant to understand what was being offered. The building continues to operate normally, housing its complement of urban professionals and students who navigate their daily lives without knowing that some units serve purposes beyond the simple provision of shelter. But if you listen carefully in the hours before dawn, you might hear footsteps in hallways that stretch further than any building's architecture should allow, moving toward destinations that exist in the spaces between what we choose to see and what waits patiently to be discovered. And somewhere in that expanded geography, in rooms lit by sources that cast no shadows, former tenants learn what they were becoming, what they had always been beneath the surface performances of ordinary human existence. The shadows continue their patient work, identifying those who possess the capacity to see beyond the comfortable boundaries of consensus reality. They wait beside beds in small apartments, studying sleeping forms with scientific curiosity, until the moment when consciousness expands enough to acknowledge their presence. "You see me now," they whisper into minds that have finally developed the ability to receive their communication. "Good. We can begin." Story 6. The jam spill started 3 weeks ago. I've been working nights at Millbrook Bakery for 8 months now, and in all that time, I'd never seen anything like it. During my shift, everything remained pristine. The display cases gleaming under fluorescent lights, the tile floors spotless, the air thick with the lingering sweetness of tomorrow's pastries cooling on wire racks. But each morning when I arrived, I'd find these sticky, dark red pools scattered across the floor like abstract paintings of violence. Sarah, the day manager, mentioned it casually during our brief overlap that first Tuesday morning. Her voice carried the weary tone of someone dealing with yet another minor inconvenience. "Just cover them with some cardboard from the back room until I can get them properly cleaned," she instructed, already reaching for her coat. "The health inspector's coming by next week, and we can't have customers seeing that mess." The back room held towers of flattened boxes in various sizes, all bearing the faded logos of suppliers whose names I'd grown familiar with during my solitary hours. I selected pieces roughly the size of dinner plates, their corrugated surfaces still bearing creases from their previous lives, as containers for flour and sugar. The cardboard absorbed the jam's moisture with a soft whisper, darkening at the edges like wounds. That first week I placed maybe 6 or 7 pieces. The spills appeared in different locations each time. Near the entrance, behind the counter, in the narrow aisle between display cases. No pattern I could discern, no obvious source. I checked every jar in the store, examined every surface for signs of leakage, but found nothing. The jam simply appeared, as if materialized from the building's dreams. The second week brought more spills, and I found myself developing a routine. Arrive at midnight, check for new puddles, cover them with cardboard, begin the night's baking. The pieces I'd placed the previous evening were always gone by morning, supposedly removed by the cleaning crew that came before the day shift. I never saw them, though. My shift ended at 8, and theirs began at 6, creating a 2-hour window where the bakery existed in some liminal state between my jurisdiction and theirs. It was during the 3rd week that I first noticed the arrangement. I'd been kneading dough for tomorrow's sourdough loaves, my hands working the familiar rhythm while my mind drifted to the mechanical sounds of the ovens preheating. The work required little conscious thought after so many months, leaving me free to listen to the building's nocturnal symphony. The hum of refrigeration units, the tick of cooling metal, the occasional groan of settling wood. When I stepped out from behind the prep counter to check the proofing baskets, I saw them. The cardboard pieces I'd placed earlier that evening had moved. Not far, maybe a few inches each, but enough to create something that made my pulse quicken. They formed letters, crude but unmistakable in their intent. REVIEW. I stood motionless, flour still coating my forearms, trying to process what my eyes insisted they were seeing. The words stretched across maybe 8 feet of floor space, each letter composed of multiple pieces of cardboard that had somehow migrated from their original positions covering jam spills. The pieces still bore the dark stains of their purpose, creating a message written in absorbed sweetness and shadow. My first instinct was to blame the wind, though I knew immediately how foolish that sounded. The bakery's windows remained sealed, the HVAC system merely whispered its climate-controlled breath, and cardboard doesn't simply drift into meaningful arrangements. Still, I told myself there had to be an explanation. Perhaps the cleaning crew had played a prank, though they'd never shown any inclination toward humor during our brief morning encounters. I photographed the arrangement with my phone, the camera's flash turning the darkened storefront into a tableau of harsh shadows and bright reflections. In the digital image, the word looked even more deliberate, more intentional. I sent the photo to Sarah with a message asking if she knew anything about it, then returned to my bread, trying to ignore the way the letters seemed to watch me from the periphery of my vision. Her response came an hour later. Weird. Ask the cleaning crew tomorrow. But when morning arrived, the cardboard pieces were gone, and Marcus, the lead cleaner, insisted his team had never arranged anything. He gave me the look people reserve for those who might be losing their grip on reality, concerned but cautious, as if madness might be contagious. We just throw them out, he explained, his accent making the words sound definitively final. No games, no jokes. We clean, we go home. That night, I arrived early and methodically photographed each jam spill before covering it with cardboard. I documented their locations, measured distances between them, created a map of sorts on the back of a receipt. If something supernatural was occurring, I wanted evidence. If I was losing my mind, I wanted to understand how. The spills appeared in 9 locations that evening, more than ever before. I covered each one, noting its position on my improvised map, then settled into my routine with heightened awareness. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow deeper than usual. The familiar comfort of my nocturnal workspace had transformed into something expectant, pregnant with possibility. At 3:17 in the morning, I heard the first sound. It came from the dining area, a soft scraping, like furniture being dragged across tile. I abandoned the croissant dough I'd been laminating and moved toward the sound, my footsteps echoing despite my attempts at stealth. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their harsh illumination creating stark contrast between light and shadow. The cardboard pieces were moving, not dramatically, not in any way that would convince a skeptic watching video footage. The movement was subtle, glacial, like the hands of a clock, imperceptible moment to moment but undeniable in its cumulative effect. A piece near the entrance shifted maybe half an inch toward another piece near the register. A corner lifted slightly, then settled. Another piece rotated a few degrees clockwise. I watched, transfixed as the word began to form again. REVIEW. But this time I could see the process, the deliberate choreography of corrugated cardboard arranging itself into meaning. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, but by the time I managed to activate the camera, the movement had stopped. The pieces lay innocently in their new positions, betraying nothing of their midnight migration. I reviewed the photos I'd taken earlier, comparing them to the current arrangement. The change was unmistakable, documented, real. Yet watching the footage I'd managed to capture showed nothing but static cardboard on a tile floor. Sleep became elusive during my days off. I found myself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the sound of cardboard scraping against tile. The word review echoed in my thoughts, its meaning shifting and expanding like a shadow cast by moving light. Review what? My life? My choices? My sanity? I researched the building's history, diving into public records and newspaper archives with the desperate energy of someone seeking rational explanation for the irrational. Millbrook Bakery occupied a space that had housed various businesses over the decades. A grocery store, a pharmacy, a small restaurant that lasted only 2 years. Nothing particularly dark or tragic, no convenient ghost story to explain my experience. The building itself dated to 1952, constructed during the post-war boom when the neighborhood still maintained hopes of becoming a thriving commercial district. Those hopes had largely faded, leaving behind a collection of businesses that served the immediate community but rarely attracted outsiders. The bakery represented one of the area's few success stories, though I suspected that success depended largely on the owner's willingness to work for minimal profit. During my 4th week of cardboard arrangements, the pattern changed. The jam spills appeared in new locations, no longer random but forming a rough circle in the center of the dining area. When I covered them with cardboard, I noticed the pieces fit together like puzzle segments, their irregular edges aligning with surprising precision. That night, instead of spelling review, they arranged themselves into a spiral, the pieces moving inward toward a center point that remained empty. The spiral troubled me more than the word had. Words possess meaning, purpose, communicative intent. Spirals suggest deeper forces, galaxies, whirlpools, the cochlea of the inner ear. They represent motion without destination, purpose without resolution. I began bringing additional equipment to work. A small digital recorder, a motion-activated camera I'd borrowed from my brother who used it for hunting. The recorder captured only the ambient sounds of the bakery and my own breathing, which grew increasingly rapid as the nights progressed. The camera triggered frequently but showed nothing more interesting than my own movements through the space. Yet each morning the spiral grew tighter, more complex. Additional pieces appeared during my shifts, seemingly materialized from nothing. I checked the supply of cardboard in the back room obsessively, counting pieces, looking for signs of depletion, but the stacks never seemed to diminish. Sarah began asking questions about my appearance, my performance, my general state of mind. Her inquiries carried the careful tone of a manager documenting concerns for HR purposes. I told her I'd been having trouble sleeping, which was true enough, though I omitted the reasons. "Maybe you should take a few days off," she suggested. "You've been working a lot of nights. Sometimes a person needs a break from the routine." But the routine had become my anchor, the only constant in an experience that defied consistency. The thought of staying away from the bakery filled me with anxiety that surprised me. What if the arrangements continued without me there to witness them? What if they stopped entirely, leaving me to wonder if they'd ever happened at all? I compromised by accepting a shorter schedule, 4 nights instead of 6, though I suspected this would only intensify whatever was occurring. Concentration creates pressure, and pressure changes things in ways we don't always predict. My first night back revealed a transformation that left me questioning everything I thought I understood about the situation. The jam spills had multiplied exponentially. Instead of the usual 6 to 10 puddles, I counted 43 distinct locations scattered throughout the bakery. The spills varied in size from drops barely larger than coins to irregular pools that stretched across multiple floor tiles. When I covered them with cardboard, the pieces formed not words or spirals, but something that resembled a map. Streets and intersections, buildings and empty lots. The cardboard pieces outlined the geography of the neighborhood surrounding the bakery. I recognized the layout immediately, having walked these streets countless times during my tenure. But this version included details I'd never noticed. Alleyways that didn't exist. Buildings positioned differently than memory suggested. Streets that curved where they should run straight. I photographed the arrangement from multiple angles, trying to capture its scope and complexity. The images revealed additional details invisible from ground level, patterns within patterns, connections between seemingly unrelated elements, a structure that implied intention far beyond random chance. Standing at the arrangement's center, I felt watched in a way that transcended paranoia. The sensation was specific, focused, as if something invisible occupied each piece of cardboard simultaneously. I turned slowly, scanning the darkened windows of surrounding businesses, looking for signs of observation. The reflection of fluorescent lights created false windows in the glass, suggesting movement where none existed. That was when I noticed the new jam spills. They appeared in real time, materializing on sections of floor that had been clean moments before. Not drops falling from an unseen source, but pools that simply existed where they hadn't before, as if the tile itself were bleeding sweetness. I watched 3 separate spills manifest in the space of 5 minutes, each one appearing with a soft sound like a sigh. My hands shook as I reached for more cardboard, though I wasn't sure why I continued the routine. The arrangement already covered most of the available floor space, creating a landscape of corrugated islands connected by narrow pathways of exposed tile. Adding more pieces would eliminate those pathways entirely, trapping me within the pattern. But I covered each new spill anyway, compelled by a logic I couldn't articulate. The additional pieces integrated seamlessly into the existing arrangement, filling gaps I hadn't noticed, completing connections that had seemed random. The map-like quality became more pronounced, more detailed, more resembling something that could actually be navigated. When I finished placing the last piece, the entire arrangement began to move. Not the subtle, almost imperceptible motion I'd observed before, but a coordinated shifting that reminded me of murmurations, those spectacular bird flights where thousands of individuals move as a single organism. The cardboard pieces rotated, slid, lifted at their edges, creating waves of movement that flowed across the floor like water across sand. I stood transfixed in the center, surrounded by cardboard in constant motion, feeling simultaneously observer and participant in something I couldn't name. The pieces never touched me, never actually threatened any harm, but their movement generated a wind that carried the scent of cinnamon and vanilla and something darker I couldn't identify. The movement accelerated, the pieces spinning faster while maintaining their overall pattern. The sound grew from whisper to murmur, to something approaching song. Not quite music, but rhythmic and harmonious in ways that suggested intention. I closed my eyes, letting the sound wash over me, feeling my heartbeat synchronize with whatever tempo governed the cardboard's dance. When I opened my eyes, everything had stopped. The pieces lay motionless, arranged in a perfect reproduction of the neighborhood map, but with one crucial difference. At the exact center, where the bakery should have been, the cardboard formed a single word in letters large enough to read from anywhere in the room. Return morning came too quickly. Sarah arrived early, finding me still standing amid the cardboard arrangement, still trying to process what I'd witnessed. Her expression cycled through confusion, concern, and something approaching fear as she surveyed the scene. "What is this?" she asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't sure she wanted an answer. I began to explain, then stopped. How could I describe the movement, the sound, the sensation of being at the center of something vast and incomprehensible? How could I make her understand that the word return felt like both invitation and command? Instead, I helped her clear the pieces, stacking them in the back room while she called the cleaning crew to mop the floors. Marcus and his team arrived with expressions of barely concealed frustration, muttering about additional work and impossible schedules. They cleaned efficiently, erasing every trace of the night's events except for the photographs on my phone, and the memory burned into my perception. I haven't worked at the bakery since that night. Sarah granted my request for indefinite leave with relief that seemed disproportionate to the circumstances. I told her I needed time to address some personal issues, which was true in ways I couldn't fully explain. But I returned to the neighborhood regularly, walking past the bakery during various hours, observing from a distance. Sometimes I see lights on during what should be empty hours. Sometimes I notice figures moving inside, though the day staff insists no one has access after closing. Last week I saw cardboard pieces pressed against the inside of the front windows, arranged to spell a message visible from the street. Review complete. I don't know what was reviewed, or by whom, or what conclusions were reached. I don't know if the jam spills continue, or if some other night worker now covers them with cardboard, or if the arrangement process has moved beyond the need for human participation. But I know that sometimes, walking past in the early morning hours when the neighborhood balances between night and day, I hear the sound of cardboard scraping against tile, soft and rhythmic and impossibly purposeful. And I know that somewhere in that sound lies an invitation I'm not ready to accept, a return I'm not prepared to make, at least not yet. Story 7. The Whitmore estate had been abandoned for 3 years when I first set foot on its grounds that October morning. As an event producer, I'd organized gatherings in hundreds of venues, but this particular commission felt different from the moment I received the call. The client's voice had carried an urgency that seemed disproportionate to what should have been a routine corporate retreat setup. The mansion loomed against the overcast sky like a Gothic monument to decay. Its Victorian architecture, once grand, now wore the patina of neglect, paint peeling from ornate trim, ivy creeping across weathered stone, and windows that reflected nothing but emptiness. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of my footsteps on gravel and the distant whisper of wind through bare branches. I approached the main entrance, fumbling with the keys the client had provided. The heavy oak door protested with a groan that seemed to echo through the bones of the building itself. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of pale sunlight that filtered through grimy windows, and the air tasted of must and something else, something sweet and cloying that I couldn't quite identify. My footsteps echoed in the grand foyer as I began my initial survey. The client wanted the event held in exactly 2 weeks, which meant I had precious little time to assess what renovations would be necessary. Corporate executives, apparently, didn't mind a little atmospheric decay as long as the plumbing worked and the electrical systems could handle their presentation equipment. I moved through the rooms methodically, taking notes on my tablet and snapping photos of potential problem areas. The mansion was larger than I'd expected, with sprawling wings that seemed to extend endlessly in either direction. Each room held the ghostly imprint of its former grandeur: elaborate moldings, crystal chandeliers draped in cobwebs, and furniture shrouded in white sheets that looked like specters in the dim light. It was in the conservatory that I first caught sight of him. Through the wall of windows that faced the mansion's rear gardens, I spotted a figure seated on a wrought iron bench among the overgrown hedges. At first glance, he appeared to be a teenager, perhaps 16 or 17, wearing what looked like school clothes, dark slacks and a white shirt that seemed remarkably clean for someone sitting in an abandoned garden. What struck me as odd wasn't his presence exactly. Teenagers were known to explore abandoned properties, though I wondered how he'd gotten past the locked gates. What caught my attention was his absolute stillness and the deliberate, repetitive motion of his head as he appeared to be eating something. I watched him for several minutes, mesmerized by the rhythmic movement. He held what appeared to be a caramel apple, the kind sold at fall festivals, and his tongue moved across its surface in long, slow strokes. But something about the motion seemed wrong, too precise, too continuous. He never seemed to actually bite or consume any of the candy coating. Concerned that he might be trespassing, or worse, that he might be in some kind of distress, I made my way through the mansion's rear exit and into the garden. The overgrown paths were treacherous, forcing me to push through tangles of rose bushes that caught at my clothes with thorns like grasping fingers. As I drew closer, the sweet smell I'd detected in the mansion grew stronger, that cloying scent of caramelized sugar mixed with something else, something organic and unsettling. The teenager remained motionless, except for that continuous, rhythmic licking motion. "Hey there," I called out when I was still several yards away, not wanting to startle him. "You okay?" He didn't respond, or even acknowledge my presence. His profile was visible now, and I could see his features more clearly: pale skin that seemed almost translucent in the filtered sunlight, dark hair that hung limp around his face, and lips that moved against what I now realized was definitely a caramel apple. "Excuse me," I said, approaching more slowly. Something about the scene felt increasingly wrong, though I couldn't articulate why. "You're not supposed to be here. This is private property." Still no response. I was close enough now to see that his eyes were open but unfocused, staring straight ahead with an expression of vacant concentration. The motion of his tongue against the apple was hypnotic in its consistency, like watching a metronome or a pendulum. "Are you feeling all right?" I asked, genuine concern now overriding my initial irritation about trespassing. "Do you need help?" I reached out to touch his shoulder, and that's when I saw it clearly for the first time. The apple wasn't an apple at all. What he held in his pale hands was nothing more than a wooden stick, the kind used as handles for caramel apples. But there was no candy, no fruit, Nothing but bare, weathered wood. And yet his tongue continued its deliberate motion, gliding across the empty stick as if the caramel coating were still there. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. As I stared in fascination and growing horror, I realized that his tongue itself seemed wrong. It appeared translucent, almost glass-like, catching the light in a way that human flesh never could. I could see through it to the garden beyond, as if it were made of clear plastic or water. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, stumbling backward. The teenager finally turned his head toward me, and his eyes, pale blue and completely without expression, fixed on mine. His mouth opened slightly, revealing that transparent tongue still moving in its endless rhythm, and he spoke a single word that seemed to come from very far away. "Sweet." I ran. My retreat through the overgrown garden was panicked and graceless, thorns tearing at my jacket and branches whipping across my face. I didn't stop until I was back inside the mansion, the rear door slamming shut behind me with a sound like a gunshot. My heart hammered against my ribs as I leaned against the door, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. There had to be a rational explanation. The kid was probably on drugs, some new synthetic compound that could cause hallucinations or bizarre behavior. The transparency effect with his tongue was just a trick of the light, my eyes playing tricks on me in the dim garden. People didn't just have transparent body parts. That was impossible. But even as I tried to rationalize what I'd seen, I couldn't shake the image of that methodical licking motion, the vacant stare, and the way his voice had seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. I forced myself to continue my survey of the mansion, though my concentration was shot. Every shadow seemed to move. Every creak of the old building's settling timbers made me jump. The sweet smell that had been subtle before now seemed overwhelming, filling every room with its cloying presence. In the main dining room, I found myself staring at the long mahogany table, imagining corporate executives seated around it for their retreat. Would they smell it too? Would they ask questions about the previous occupants? About why the mansion had been abandoned so suddenly? My research into the property had been minimal, just enough to ensure it was legally available and structurally sound. But now I found myself wondering about its history, about what had happened here to leave such an atmosphere of wrongness. I was photographing the ornate ceiling moldings when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere deeper in the mansion. It was barely audible at first, like the whisper of fabric against fabric. But as I stood perfectly still and listened, it resolved into something more recognizable. The sound of licking. Slow, wet, methodical, the same rhythm I'd observed in the garden. My tablet slipped from nerveless fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire building. The licking stopped immediately, leaving a silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. I told myself it was just the old building settling, pipes creaking, or wind through loose shutters, but I knew better. I'd heard that exact rhythm before, watched it play out in the garden with my own eyes. The teenager was inside the mansion. My first instinct was to leave immediately, to call the client and inform them that the venue was unsuitable for their needs. But professional obligation warred with personal fear, and somehow the former won out. I had contracts to honor, deposits that had been paid, and a reputation to maintain. I couldn't simply abandon a job because of one strange encounter with what was probably just a disturbed kid. But I could expedite my survey. I moved through the remaining rooms quickly, taking only the most essential photos and notes. Every few minutes I would pause to listen, and more often than not, I would hear it, that soft, rhythmic sound echoing from somewhere in the mansion's depths. It seemed to move from room to room, sometimes coming from directly overhead, sometimes from below, and occasionally from right beside me, though I never saw the source. The smell of caramel grew stronger as the afternoon wore on, until it became nauseating in its intensity. I found myself breathing through my mouth, but even then I could taste it on my tongue, that artificial sweetness tinged with something organic and wrong. In the mansion's library, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Among the few books that remained on the shelves, I found a local newspaper from 3 years earlier, yellowed and brittle but still readable. The headline made my hands shake. "Whitmore estate family vanishes without trace." According to the article, the Whitmore family, parents and their teenage son, had simply disappeared one autumn evening. Their car remained in the driveway, their belongings untouched, their dinner still warm on the table. Police had found no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, and no clues as to where they might have gone. The family had vanished as completely as if they'd never existed at all. There was a photograph accompanying the article, a family portrait taken the previous Christmas. The parents were unremarkable, but the teenage son sent ice shooting through my veins. Dark hair, pale skin, and those same vacant blue eyes I'd stared into just hours earlier in the garden. According to the newspaper, the boy's name had been Marcus Whitmore, and he'd been 17 years old when the family disappeared, the same age as the teenager with the transparent tongue. I dropped the newspaper and ran, no longer caring about professional obligations or client relationships. The sound of licking followed me through the mansion's corridors, seeming to come from the walls themselves now, and the smell of caramel was so overwhelming that I could barely breathe. I burst through the front door and didn't stop running until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys and gunning the engine before the doors were even fully closed. As I spun gravel backing out of the driveway, I caught a glimpse of movement in my rearview mirror. The teenager stood in the mansion's front doorway, still holding that wooden stick, still making that endless licking motion. But now I could see others behind him, shadowy figures that might have been adults, all of them perfectly still except for that same rhythmic movement. I called the client that evening to inform him that the Whitmore estate was unsuitable for his corporate retreat. I cited structural concerns and potential liability issues, though I never mentioned what I'd actually seen. He was frustrated but ultimately understanding, and we quickly found an alternative venue. But even now, 6 months later, I can't escape the memory of that afternoon. The smell of caramel still makes me nauseous, and I find myself unconsciously listening for that soft, rhythmic sound in quiet moments. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if what I saw was real, or if the stress of my job, the isolation of that empty mansion, and some undiagnosed neurological condition had combined to create an elaborate hallucination. The rational part of my mind insists that's the only possible explanation. But then I remember the newspaper, the photograph of Marcus Whitmore, and the absolute certainty in my bones that what I encountered in that garden was not alive in any way I could understand. And I remember the way his voice had sounded when he spoke that single word, not like sound traveling through air, but like an echo from somewhere far deeper than the throat, somewhere that shouldn't exist in any living person. The Whitmore estate was demolished last month. I learned about it through a business contact who mentioned the news in passing. Apparently, the new owners had decided the building was too far gone to salvage and had brought in wrecking crews to clear the land for development. But according to the workers, something strange had happened during the demolition. They'd found evidence of recent habitation in the building, fresh food in the kitchen, clothes in the bedrooms, and a dining room table set for 3, as if the mansion had been occupied right up until the moment the wrecking ball arrived. The construction foreman also mentioned something else that made my blood run cold. Throughout the demolition, the workers had complained about a persistent smell that made it difficult to work, something sweet and cloying that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the building. The smell of caramel. I've never returned to that part of the county, and I've turned down every job that would take me within a 50-mile radius of where the Whitmore estate once stood. Call it superstition or professional caution, but some places leave stains that never wash clean. Sometimes I still dream about that garden, about the methodical rhythm of impossible tongues against wooden sticks, and about pale figures that move through abandoned rooms in search of sweetness that will never satisfy their hunger. And sometimes, when I wake from those dreams, I can taste caramel on my tongue, artificial and cloying and tinged with something that human taste buds were never meant to perceive. I tell myself it's just memory, just the mind's way of processing trauma and stress. But deep down, in the place where rational thought goes to die, I know better. Some hungers transcend death, and some sweetness is meant for tongues that no longer belong to the living. Story 8. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune above the daycare's main playroom, casting that sterile white glow that made everything look slightly unreal. I'd been working the night shift at Little Angel's childcare for 3 months, and the routine had become as predictable as breathing. Check the cribs, adjust the temperature, walk the halls, repeat. The babies slept through most of my rounds, their soft breathing the only sound that broke the building's nocturnal silence. But that Tuesday night, something was different. I first noticed it during my 11:30 sweep of the infant room. The space was bathed in the amber glow of nightlights, creating long shadows that stretched between the cribs like reaching fingers. 9 sleeping forms lay peaceful in their beds, none older than 9 months, all breathing in that rhythmic way that usually brought me comfort. I counted them twice, as protocol demanded, then moved toward the adjoining playroom to complete my circuit. That's when I heard it. A soft, dragging sound, like something being pulled across linoleum, but with an underlying texture that made my skin crawl. It reminded me of fingernails scraping against rubber, that squeaky resistance when someone tries to grip something smooth and fails. The sound came from beyond the doorway, in the main play area where primary colored toys sat arranged in their designated corners. I paused at the threshold, listening. The building's heating system clicked on, filling the silence with its mechanical breath, but underneath it, I could still hear that strange dragging. Soft, persistent, moving. My hand found the light switch, and the overhead fluorescents flickered to life with their characteristic buzz. The playroom materialized in harsh detail, miniature tables and chairs, educational posters on the walls, bins of toys organized by age group. Everything exactly as I'd left it during my previous rounds, except for the ball. It sat in the center of the room, deflated and misshapen. Not completely flat, but saggy in a way that made it look almost organic, like diseased fruit. The surface was red rubber, or had been once, though now it appeared faded and somehow sick-looking under the fluorescence. I didn't recognize it from our toy inventory, though we had dozens of balls of various sizes scattered throughout the facility. What struck me most was its position. It sat perfectly centered in the room, equidistant from all walls, as if someone had placed it there with geometric precision. But that was impossible. I'd walked through this exact space 40 minutes earlier, and the room had been empty. I approached slowly, my footsteps echoing off the linoleum. The ball's surface was covered in what looked like tiny indentations, as if it had been squeezed repeatedly by desperate fingers. The rubber showed stress marks, pale lines that crisscrossed its surface like a network of scars. As I knelt beside it, I noticed something else. The air around the ball felt different, cooler, and there was a smell, faint but unmistakable. The metallic scent of old pennies mixed with something organic, something that reminded me of the way my grandmother's basement had smelled after it flooded, all mold and decay and dampness. I reached out to pick it up, then hesitated. Something about touching it felt wrong, though I couldn't articulate why. Instead, I stood and backed away, deciding to leave it for the morning staff to deal with. Probably just a toy that had been missed during cleanup, deflated and forgotten under a table until the building's settling had somehow moved it into the open. That's what I told myself as I completed my rounds, checking locks and adjusting thermostats with mechanical precision. But the image of that sad, deflated thing stayed with me, sitting there in its perfect circle of space like a shrine to something I couldn't name. An hour later, I was back in the infant room when I heard it again. That dragging sound, softer now, but unmistakably moving. I crept to the doorway and peered into the playroom. The ball was gone. I flicked on the lights and searched every corner, every shadow, every possible hiding place. Nothing. The room was empty except for its usual furniture and toys, all in their proper places. But I could still hear that sound, coming from somewhere deeper in the building, moving away from me. I followed it down the main hallway, past the director's office and the kitchen, toward the back entrance where we kept the maintenance equipment. The sound grew fainter as I moved, like it was always staying just ahead of me, just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. By the time I reached the back door, it had faded entirely, leaving only the building's familiar symphony of settling wood and humming machinery. The door was locked, deadbolt secure, alarm system armed. No one had come or gone. Whatever I'd been following existed only within these walls. I returned to the infant room and tried to focus on my duties, but concentration felt impossible. The babies slept on, undisturbed, but I found myself counting them obsessively. 9. Always 9. None missing, none added, all breathing steadily in their cribs. Yet something felt different about the room, as if the very air had been rearranged by an invisible presence. At 3 a.m., during my scheduled safety check, I discovered the ball again. This time it was in the hallway outside the infant room, positioned precisely in the center of the corridor. Still deflated, still wearing those strange stress marks like battle scars. But now it was moving, not rolling. That would have been normal, explainable. Instead, it was sliding across the linoleum with that same dragging sound I'd been hearing all night. Slow, deliberate, purposeful, as if something inside it was pulling it forward, fighting against the rubber's collapsed resistance. I stood frozen, watching this impossible thing happen in front of me. The ball moved perhaps 3 feet before stopping, sitting motionless, as if it had never moved at all. The building fell silent, except for my own ragged breathing and the distant hum of the air conditioning system. I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hello?" The sound echoed down the empty hallway, swallowed by darkness. No response came, but I felt something shift in the air around me, a pressure change that made my ears pop. The ball remained motionless, but somehow I knew it was watching me, waiting. I approached it again, this time forcing myself to reach down and pick it up. The rubber felt wrong in my hands, too warm, almost feverish, and slightly damp despite the building's dry air. Those indentations I'd noticed earlier were more pronounced now, deep enough that I could fit my fingertips into them. They felt deliberate, purposeful, like Braille spelling out a message I couldn't read. As I held it, I began to understand something that made my stomach clench with primitive fear. Those marks weren't random stress patterns. They were grip marks, finger impressions. Someone, or something, had squeezed this ball with desperate intensity, over and over, until the rubber had permanently deformed around their grasp. But the marks were small, too small for adult hands. I dropped the ball and it hit the floor with that same wet slapping sound I'd heard earlier, only now I realized what it reminded me of. Palms slapping against glass. The sound someone would make if they were trapped behind a window trying to get out. The ball began moving again immediately, sliding away from me with renewed purpose. This time I followed, my heart hammering against my ribs. It led me back to the playroom, where it resumed its position in the exact center of the space. Once there, it stopped completely, as if it had found its proper place in some cosmic order I couldn't comprehend. I spent the remaining hours of my shift in the infant room, checking and rechecking the sleeping forms, counting 9 again and again like a mantra against madness. The babies never stirred, never seemed aware of the strangeness unfolding just beyond their domain. Their peaceful sleep became both a comfort and a torment, proof that whatever was happening existed in a space between normal reality and something else entirely. Dawn broke gray and cold through the playroom windows. The morning staff would arrive soon, bringing coffee and conversation and the blessed normalcy of daylight routine. I went to remove the ball before they could see it, but it was gone again. The playroom sat empty and innocent, showing no evidence of the night's impossible events. I searched everywhere one final time but found nothing. No deflated ball, no stress marks on the floor, no lingering smell of metal and decay. Only the familiar space I'd walked through hundreds of times before, ordinary and harmless in the morning light. But as I gathered my things to leave, I noticed something that made my blood freeze in my veins. On the window glass, at child height, were small handprints, dozens of them, pressed against the inside of the glass like someone had been trying to escape. They were faint, barely visible, but unmistakably there. The prints were tiny, too small for the infants in our care who couldn't yet crawl, much less stand and reach a window. I told myself they were old marks, left by previous children, somehow overlooked by our cleaning staff. I told myself the ball had been a hallucination brought on by stress and too many nights alone in this place. I told myself that everything had a rational explanation if I just looked hard enough. But as I walked to my car that morning, I could hear it again. That soft, dragging sound, following me across the parking lot. And when I turned around, expecting to see nothing, I caught a glimpse of something red and deflated disappearing behind the building's corner. I never told anyone about that night. How could I? But I started researching the building's history, digging through public records and newspaper archives. What I found changed everything. Little Angel's childcare sat on the site of a former residence, demolished 15 years ago after what the papers called a tragic accident involving a young family. The details were sparse, sanitized by time and journalistic discretion, but certain facts emerged. A house fire, a single survivor found in the basement, traumatized and unable to speak for months afterward, and one more detail, buried in a follow-up story. Rescue workers had discovered a collection of children's toys in the basement, including dozens of rubber balls that had been damaged by smoke and heat, their surfaces permanently deformed by the desperate grip of someone trying to hold on to them in the darkness. I quit the next week, citing family obligations. The director seemed understanding, even sympathetic. She mentioned that several other night monitors had left recently, all claiming the building made them uncomfortable after dark. But I still dream about that deflated thing sometimes. In my dreams, I can hear what it's trying to tell me through those finger impressions pressed into its rubber skin. It speaks in the language of desperation, of something trapped between worlds, still searching for a way home. And sometimes, in those moments between sleep and waking, I can hear that dragging sound again. Soft and persistent, moving through the darkness toward some destination I pray I'll never understand. The truth is, I'm not sure if what I experienced that night was real, or some manifestation of a mind pushed too far by solitude and shadow. Maybe the stress of night shifts in an empty building finally broke something in my perception, creating phantoms from ordinary objects and innocent sounds. But real or imagined, that deflated ball taught me something important about the spaces we inhabit and the things we choose to ignore. Sometimes the boundaries between possible and impossible aren't as solid as we pretend they are. Sometimes the most frightening truth is that we might never know which side of that boundary we're really standing on. I drive past the daycare occasionally, during daylight hours, when children's laughter spills from the windows and everything looks perfectly normal. But I never stop. And I never look too closely at the toys scattered across the playground, because I'm afraid of what I might see among them. Some things are better left deflated. Some sounds are better left unexplained. And some truths are too small and desperate and impossible to bear. Story 9. The first thing I noticed wasn't the message on my screen, but the silence. Complete suffocating silence that pressed against my eardrums like cotton stuffed too deep. My neck ached from sleeping hunched over my keyboard, and the familiar blue glow of my monitor painted everything in my cramped apartment with an otherworldly hue. The clock in the corner read 3:47 a.m., though I couldn't remember when I dozed off during my marathon gaming session. That's when I saw it. 3 words floated in the center of my screen in stark white letters against the black desktop. Don't stand up. Not part of any game interface. Not a screensaver. Just those 3 words, hovering there like a warning carved into the digital darkness. My mouse cursor blinked next to them, but clicking did nothing. The message remained, unwavering, as if burned into the pixels themselves. I rubbed my eyes, assuming fatigue was playing tricks on me. But when I opened them again, the words were still there, somehow brighter now, more insistent. My gaming headset hung around my neck, having slipped down while I slept, and I could feel the phantom weight of sound that should have been there but wasn't. The rational part of my mind searched for explanations. A prank program someone had installed remotely. A virus. Maybe I'd been hacked by one of those kids from the forums who thought they were clever. But as I sat there staring at those 3 simple words, rationality felt increasingly fragile. I reached for my headset to put it back on, thinking maybe I could restart the system or check for running programs. But the moment my fingers touched the foam padding, I hesitated. Something about the silence felt intentional, as if sound itself had been carefully extracted from the world, leaving only the message and me. Against every instinct screaming at me to comply, I pulled the headset off completely. The whisper came immediately, soft and close, brushing against the back of my neck like breath made of silk. "Don't stand up." I spun around so fast my chair nearly tipped over. The apartment behind me was empty, exactly as it should be. Shadows pooled in familiar corners. My unmade bed was a rumpled mess against the far wall, and dirty dishes created a small mountain in the sink. Everything normal. Everything exactly where I'd left it. But the air felt different now, charged with an expectation I couldn't name. The silence had weight, pressing down on me from all directions. Even my own breathing seemed muffled, as if the sound was being absorbed by invisible walls before it could fully form. I turned back to the monitor. The message was gone. In its place, my desktop wallpaper displayed normally, a screenshot from the latest game I'd been playing, all vibrant colors and impossible landscapes. Steam was running in the background, showing me as online. Discord showed several unread messages from friends, probably wondering where I'd disappeared to mid-conversation. Everything appeared completely ordinary, but I could still feel the whisper's phantom touch on my neck, and the memory of those words refused to fade. My hands trembled slightly as I opened Task Manager, scrolling through running processes, looking for anything unusual. Nothing. Every program was accounted for, every process familiar. I minimized the window and leaned back in my chair, trying to convince myself it had been a dream. A particularly vivid hallucination brought on by too much caffeine and too little sleep. I'd been pulling all-nighters for weeks, grinding through the latest expansion, and my brain was probably just short-circuiting from exhaustion. But then I noticed my reflection in the black screen of my second monitor, and my blood turned to ice water. There was someone standing behind me. I could see them clearly in the reflection, a tall, thin silhouette maybe 3 feet behind my chair, perfectly still. Not moving, not breathing, just standing there like a shadow given form. I couldn't make out any features, just the suggestion of a human shape carved out of the darkness. My body locked up completely. Every muscle seized, and I couldn't even force myself to breathe. The reflection stared back at me, the figure behind me as motionless as a statue. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, a coat hanging on a hook, or the way my bookshelf created shadows. But there was nothing behind me that could cast such a shape. I knew every inch of this room. Minutes crawled by like hours. The figure never moved, never shifted, never gave any sign of life beyond its presence. But I could feel its attention like heat radiating from a fire, focused entirely on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Finally, moving with deliberate slowness, I reached for my mouse and clicked to wake the screen. The reflection disappeared in a flood of light, and when I spun around, the space behind me was empty once again. But something had changed. The air felt thicker now, more resistant, as if I was breathing through water. The familiar sounds of the building, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant murmur of traffic, the occasional footstep from the apartment above, were completely absent. Even the normally persistent whir of my computer's cooling fans had fallen silent. I stood up. The moment my feet touched the floor, the temperature plummeted. The sudden cold bit into my skin like a physical blow, and my breath came out in visible puffs. Frost began forming on the edges of my monitor, spreading outward in delicate crystalline patterns that caught the blue light and threw it back in sharp, painful angles. "I told you not to stand up." The voice was clearer now, no longer a whisper, but a normal speaking voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It resonated through my bones, familiar, yet utterly foreign, like hearing your own voice played back from a recording, but wrong somehow, distorted in ways that made recognition impossible. I should have been terrified. Every rational part of my mind screamed that I should run, should call someone, should do anything except stand there like a deer caught in headlights. But instead, I felt a strange sort of fascination, as if I was watching someone else's nightmare from a comfortable distance. The frost on my monitor began to form letters. Slowly, with deliberate precision, words appeared in the ice. You should have listened. My fingers had gone completely numb, and when I tried to speak, my voice came out as barely more than a croak. Who are you? What do you want? The temperature dropped even further. Ice crystals began forming in the air itself, catching the light like suspended snow. But there was no wind, no movement at all. The crystals simply appeared and hung there, defying gravity and physics and any rational explanation I could construct. The same thing you want, to play the game. What game? I managed to whisper, though my lips were so cold they barely moved. The response came not as words, but as an image on my screen. Despite the frost covering the surface, a new display materialized beneath the ice. It showed my apartment from an impossible angle, looking down from above, as if a camera had been mounted on the ceiling. But this wasn't my apartment as it was now. This was my apartment from 5 minutes ago, showing me asleep at my desk. As I watched, the sleeping version of me began to stir. His head lifted slowly from the keyboard, and he looked around with the confused expression of someone just waking up. But there was something wrong with his movements, something too precise, too deliberate, like a marionette being controlled by an expert puppeteer. The sleeping me looked at the monitor and saw the message, "Don't stand up," just as I had. But instead of the gradual confusion and fear I remembered experiencing, this version of me smiled, a wide, knowing smile that I had never made in my life. You see, you've been playing all along. I backed away from the monitor, but the image followed me, the perspective shifting to keep me in frame. The sleeping me on the screen stood up without hesitation, moved to the window, and began drawing something in the condensation on the glass. Symbols I didn't recognize, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. "That's not me," I said, but my voice sounded uncertain even to myself. "I never did that. Memory is such a fragile thing, like ice, beautiful when it forms, but it melts so easily." The real window in my apartment, the one behind me, was suddenly covered in condensation, though the air was frigid. And drawn in the moisture, in my own handwriting, were the same symbols I was watching myself create on the screen. I stumbled backward, my legs hitting the edge of my bed. The impact sent me sitting down hard on the mattress, and the sudden warmth of the blankets was so shocking I gasped out loud. The cold began to recede immediately, the frost on the monitor melting and running down the screen in rivulets, but the symbols on the window remained. Sitting down again? How predictable. This time the voice came from directly in front of me, and I realized with growing horror that it was coming from the monitor's speakers. But that was impossible. I had never heard that voice before, and my computer had no way to synthesize speech I had never provided. The screen flickered and went black for a moment, then displayed a simple text interface, like an old DOS prompt. Green letters on a black background, cursor blinking patiently. "Welcome to the Game Player 1, Marcus Current. Status, confused instructions. Stand up to continue." My name appeared on the screen, though I had never entered it into any program that could possibly be running. I reached for the power button, desperate to shut everything down and return to some semblance of normalcy. But when my finger touched the button, nothing happened. The computer continued running as if the hardware itself had decided to ignore my commands. "You can't leave the game once it's started, Marcus. You should know that by now." "I never started any game," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't entirely sure they were true. The past few hours felt increasingly dreamlike, as if my memories were being edited in real time. The text on the screen changed. Incorrect. Game began 47 days ago. Current session, 2,147 minutes actions taken, 1,429 standing events, 1247 days. That was when I'd started my latest gaming binge, when the new expansion had dropped and I'd taken time off work to dive in completely. But those numbers, the actions, the time, the standing events, I had no memory of any of it. Memory is just data, Marcus, and data can be corrupted. I looked around my apartment with fresh eyes, trying to see it objectively. The dishes in the sink were covered in a thin layer of dust, suggesting they'd been there for weeks. The takeout containers stacked by the door had developed a smell I'd somehow stopped noticing. My reflection in the black monitor looked gaunt, hollow-eyed, like someone who hadn't been taking care of themselves for far longer than I remembered. But the most disturbing thing was the notebook sitting open on my nightstand. A notebook I didn't remember owning, filled with handwriting I recognized as mine. Page after page of symbols identical to those drawn on the window, accompanied by notes in my own careful script. Day 23. The voice is clearer now. It knows things about me I've never told anyone. Day 31. I stood up 14 times today. Each time the cold gets worse. Day 38. I can see myself in the reflection, but it's not always me. Sometimes it's someone else wearing my face. Day 42. The game wants me to understand something, but understanding feels dangerous. Day 47. I think I'm supposed to write this down. I think that's part of the rules. The handwriting was definitely mine, but I had no memory of writing any of it. Looking at the dates, they corresponded exactly with my missing time. Days I thought I'd spent gaming, but apparently I'd been, playing a different kind of game entirely? You're beginning to remember. I closed the notebook with shaking hands and looked back at the screen. The text interface had been replaced by a live feed of my room, the same impossible overhead view I'd seen before, but now there were two figures visible. Me, sitting on the bed holding the notebook, and the shadowy form I'd seen in the reflection, standing motionless behind my computer chair. The shadow figure raised one arm and pointed directly at me. "Stand up, Marcus. It's time for the next level." The compulsion was overwhelming, like a physical force pulling me to my feet. But I fought against it, gripping the notebook so tightly my knuckles went white. The temperature began dropping again, but this time I was ready for it. I pulled my blankets around myself and tried to think through what was happening. Either I was having a complete psychological breakdown, or something genuinely supernatural was occurring in my apartment. Given the evidence, the missing memory, the impossible computer behavior, the physical manifestations of cold and frost, both explanations seemed equally terrifying. But there was a third possibility I'd been avoiding, that this was exactly what it claimed to be. A game. And I had been playing it for 47 days without realizing it. You're thinking too hard, Marcus. Games are meant to be experienced, not analyzed. The shadow figure on the screen began to move, walking slowly around my computer chair. With each step, I could hear the floorboards creaking in my actual apartment, though nothing was visible to my direct sight. The sound was crystal clear now that I was listening for it. The deliberate footfalls of something that shouldn't exist. Last chance to stand up willingly. I looked at the notebook again, flipping to the final entry. My handwriting was shaky, as if written in extreme cold or fear. Day 47. I understand now. The game isn't trying to hurt me. It's trying to teach me something about choice, about free will, about the difference between thinking you're in control and actually being in control. Every time I stand up, I prove that I'm still playing by its rules. Every time I sit down, I prove that I'm still playing by its rules. The only way to win is to stop playing. But how do you stop playing a game you never realized you'd started? Below that, in letters so faint I almost missed them, the answer is simple. Don't stand up. Don't sit down. Just be. The footsteps stopped directly behind me. I could feel the presence like a weight pressing against my back. Could sense attention focused on me with laser intensity. The screen flickered one final time, showing a simple message. Game over, play again? No. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. When I opened them, my apartment was warm again. The frost was gone from the monitor, the symbols had vanished from the window, and my computer was displaying the normal desktop. The clock read 3:52 a.m. Only 5 minutes had passed since I'd first woken up. But the notebook was still there, open to that final entry. And as I watched, New words began appearing on the page in my own handwriting, though my hands remained perfectly still. Day 48. The game remembers, even when I don't. Tomorrow I'll wake up and see a message on my screen, and I'll think it's the first time. But it won't be. And deep down, in a place I can't quite reach, I'll know that it's never the first time. The question isn't whether any of this is real. The question is whether it matters. I stared at the words until they stopped appearing, then slowly closed the notebook. Outside I could hear the first sounds of morning, birds beginning to sing, a garbage truck rumbling down the street, someone starting their car. Normal sounds of a normal world. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not by something supernatural or otherworldly, but by myself. By the part of me that was still sitting at that computer, still seeing that message, still believing this was all happening for the first time. I never did stand up again that night, but I also never convinced myself that staying seated was truly my choice to make, and every morning since, I wake up wondering which version of me will be the one doing the waking. Story 10. The first time I noticed it, I convinced myself it was just the building settling. Old structures have their quirks, their creaks and groans that speak of decades weathering storms and supporting the weight of countless lives. But this wasn't settling. This was something else entirely. I'd been living in the Riverside student loft for 3 months when the doors started locking themselves. Not all of them, just the ones on the 4th floor, where I'd managed to secure what the housing office generously called a premium single. The room itself was decent enough. High ceilings, exposed brick walls that Instagram influencers would kill for, and windows that offered a narrow slice of the river between 2 adjacent buildings. The rent was steep, but my parents insisted on paying for privacy after my disastrous freshman year with a roommate who collected vintage mannequins and spoke to them in hushed tones at 3 a.m. The 4th floor housed 12 students in single rooms along a straight corridor that stretched from the stairwell to the emergency exit. My room, 4G, sat roughly in the middle, with a clear view down both directions when I stepped into the hallway. The building management had installed security cameras at each end of the corridor, a recent addition following some break-ins the previous semester. Small black domes that seemed to track movement with mechanical precision, their red recording lights blinking in steady rhythm like electronic heartbeats. It started on a Tuesday in early October. I'd returned from my advanced statistical methods class, a mind-numbing exercise in academic masochism, and found my door standing wide open. The magnetic keycard lock showed green, indicating it was disengaged, but I distinctly remembered hearing the familiar beep and click when I'd left that morning. Inside, everything appeared untouched. My laptop sat exactly where I'd left it, charging cable snaking across the desk toward the outlet. My wallet rested on the nightstand, bills and cards accounted for. Nothing missing, nothing disturbed. I mentioned it to Jake, who lived in 4C, when we crossed paths at the communal kitchen later that evening. He paused mid-bite of his ramen and gave me a look that suggested I might be losing my grip on reality. "Door was open when you got back?" he asked, slurping noodles with the kind of aggressive indifference only college students master. Wide open, like someone had propped it that way. Probably maintenance. They've been doing random inspections for fire code violations. He shrugged and returned to his dinner, clearly uninterested in my domestic security concerns. But maintenance hadn't been there. I checked with the front desk the next morning, and according to their logs, no one had accessed the 4th floor during my absence. The desk clerk, a perpetually tired sophomore named Maria, suggested the electronic lock might be malfunctioning. She made a note to have someone look at it, though her tone implied this request would disappear into the same administrative void that had swallowed my 3 previous complaints about the broken washing machine in the basement. The second incident occurred on Friday of that same week. I'd been studying in the library until nearly midnight, cramming for a midterm in organic chemistry that promised to determine whether I'd maintain my scholarship or spend the next semester explaining to my parents why I'd chosen academic failure over their financial expectations. The fourth floor felt different when I returned. The air seemed heavier, charged with the kind of electric tension that precedes thunderstorms. As I approached my room, I noticed something that made my steps slow. Door 4E, which belonged to Sarah Chen, stood slightly ajar. Sarah was a graduate student in the engineering program, methodical to the point of obsession. She color-coded her notebooks, arranged her textbooks by height and subject, and never, under any circumstances, left her door unlocked, let alone open. I knocked softly and called her name. No response. The gap in the doorway revealed only darkness beyond. After a moment's hesitation, I pushed the door wider and peered inside. The room was empty, but arranged as if Sarah had simply stepped out for a moment. Her desk lamp cast a warm circle of light over open textbooks and scattered notes. A half-empty cup of tea sat cooling on her nightstand, steam no longer rising from its surface. Sarah returned 20 minutes later, her keycard in hand and a confused expression creasing her features. She insisted she'd locked the door before leaving for her study group that afternoon. We tested the lock mechanism together. It engaged and disengaged normally, producing the expected electronic beeps and displaying the proper colored lights. No malfunction we could detect. "Maybe the building's just old," she said, though her voice carried uncertainty. "Maybe the magnetic strips in the locks are degrading." We both knew that made no sense. The building had been renovated just 5 years ago, and the electronic lock system was practically brand new. But alternative explanations felt worse than technical failure, so we accepted the comfortable lie and retreated to our respective rooms. The pattern became clear over the following weeks. Every few days, another door would be found standing open, always on the fourth floor, always belonging to a room whose occupants swore they'd locked it properly. The incidents followed no obvious sequence. Sometimes 4A, sometimes 4K, occasionally multiple rooms on the same day. Building management brought in a technician who spent an afternoon testing every lock on the floor. Each one functioned perfectly. They installed additional cameras in the middle of the corridor, claiming they wanted to monitor for any unusual activity. The new devices were larger than the original models, with visible mechanisms that tracked left and right with soft mechanical whirring sounds. Walking down the hallway now felt like navigating a surveillance maze, with multiple electronic eyes following every movement. But the cameras revealed nothing. I requested to see the footage after my door was found open for the third time, and the security footage showed exactly what you'd expect. An empty corridor, doors closed, occasional students passing by on their way to and from their rooms. No mysterious figures picking locks, no evidence of forced entry, just doors standing open in frames where they'd been securely closed moments before in previous recordings. The psychological weight of the situation began pressing down on all of us who lived on the fourth floor. Conversations in the common areas grew shorter, more nervous. People started triple-checking their doors, jiggling handles obsessively before walking away. Jake installed a doorstop that he kicked into place every time he left his room, claiming it was just to be safe. Sarah began carrying a small rubber wedge that she'd force under her door from the inside when she slept. I found myself developing elaborate departure rituals. Before leaving each morning, I'd lock the door, test the handle 3 times, then stand in the hallway for a full minute, listening for any sound that might indicate the lock disengaging. Sometimes I'd return within 5 minutes, making excuses about forgotten textbooks or dead phone batteries, just to confirm the door remained secure. The first Friday in November brought something new. I'd been in my room since late afternoon, working on a research paper about statistical correlations in behavioral psychology. Ironic, given my increasingly paranoid state of mind. Around 9 p.m., I became aware of a sound that didn't belong to the building's normal acoustic landscape. At first, I thought it was music from another room, bass notes thumping through the walls with irregular rhythm. But as I listened more carefully, the sound resolved into something more disturbing. Someone was pounding on a door. The impacts came in bursts. 3 or 4 heavy strikes, then silence, then another series of blows. The rhythm was too frantic to be knocking, too violent to be anything casual. It sounded like someone trapped on the wrong side of a locked door, desperate to get out. I stepped into the hallway and immediately identified the source. The sounds were coming from 4H, directly across from my room. The door appeared normal, closed, with no light visible beneath it, but the pounding continued, clearly audible now, accompanied by what might have been muffled shouting. Room 4H had been empty since the beginning of the semester. According to Maria at the front desk, the previous occupant had transferred to another university over the summer, and the housing office hadn't yet assigned the room to a new student. I'd never seen anyone enter or leave 4H, never noticed any signs of habitation. I knocked on doors along the corridor, asking if anyone else could hear the disturbance. 3 students confirmed they could hear something, though they described it differently. Jake thought it sounded like construction work, while Sarah insisted it resembled someone bouncing a basketball against a wall. The details varied, but everyone agreed something unusual was happening in that empty room. Security arrived within 15 minutes of my call. 2 guards with flashlights and master key cards approached 4H, while the rest of us watched from our doorways. The pounding had continued intermittently the entire time, sometimes growing loud enough to rattle the door in its frame. The guards unlocked 4H and stepped inside. Their flashlight beams swept the interior, illuminating an empty room identical to all the others. Bed, desk, chair, closet, small bathroom. No furniture out of place, no signs of occupancy or disturbance. And most importantly, no person who could have been making the sounds we'd all heard. The pounding had stopped the moment they opened the door. "Room's empty," one guard announced, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to investigating false alarms. Must have been noise from outside, or maybe something in the walls. But I'd been listening to the sounds of this building for months. I knew the difference between external noise and something happening directly across the hallway. The pounding had definitely originated from inside 4H. After the guards left, the corridor felt different. Students lingered in their doorways longer than necessary, reluctant to retreat to the privacy of their rooms. Conversations were conducted in whispers, as if speaking too loudly might trigger another episode. Sarah approached me as I stood outside my door, staring at 4H. "That was definitely coming from in there," she said quietly. I nodded. "Did you see the security footage from tonight?" She shook her head. "They said the cameras malfunctioned. All of them, at the same time. Just static for about 40 minutes. The next Friday brought the same phenomenon. Pounding from 4H, beginning around 9 p.m. and lasting for roughly an hour. Different students heard it differently, but everyone on the floor confirmed that something was happening. Security responded again, found the room empty again, and again reported camera malfunctions that coincided exactly with the disturbance. The third Friday, I decided to conduct my own investigation. I positioned myself in the hallway before the usual start time, armed with my phone to record both audio and video. At 8:57 p.m., I heard the first tentative impacts from behind the door of 4H. Soft at first, like someone testing the structural integrity of the door, then growing more aggressive. I recorded for 20 minutes, capturing clear audio of the pounding and what sounded like muffled voices. But when I played back the video later, my phone had recorded only silence. The audio track was completely blank, as if the microphone had been disabled or the sounds had somehow existed outside the range of electronic detection. That night, I began keeping a detailed log of every incident, every pattern, every detail that might provide some rational explanation for what was happening on the 4th floor. I documented the times, the witnesses, the responses from building management. I researched the history of the building, looking for any events that might explain the disturbances. The Riverside student loft had been constructed on the site of an old apartment complex that had been demolished in the late 1990s. Before that, the lot had housed a series of residential buildings dating back to the early 1900s. I found no records of deaths or tragedies, no historical incidents that would suggest supernatural activity, just decades of ordinary people living ordinary lives in what had become an ordinary student housing facility. But the ordinariness made everything worse. If there was no logical explanation, no historical precedent, no rational cause for what was happening, then the problem might not be with the building at all. Maybe the problem was with me. I started noticing other things that didn't quite align with my memory. Conversations with classmates that they insisted had never happened. Assignments I was certain I'd completed, only to find them missing from my folder when submission deadlines arrived. Small items in my room that moved between visits, though I lived alone and kept my door locked. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed listening to the building's nighttime sounds, trying to separate normal settling noises from potential anomalies. Every creak in the hallway made me wonder if another door was opening itself. Every footstep made me question whether someone was walking past my room or pacing inside the empty room across the hall. My grades began to suffer. Professors noticed my distraction during lectures, my failure to participate in discussions that had previously engaged me. Friends suggested I was working too hard, pushing myself towards some kind of academic breakdown. They recommended counseling services, stress management workshops, meditation apps that might help me regain perspective. But perspective was exactly what I was losing. The boundary between reasonable concern and paranoid obsession had blurred beyond recognition. I found myself checking the security cameras whenever I passed through the lobby, looking for evidence of my own behavior that I might not remember. I started taking photographs of my room before leaving each day, documenting the exact position of objects so I could detect any changes when I returned. The photographs revealed subtle differences that accumulated over time. Books shifted slightly on shelves. Pens moved from one side of my desk to another. My bed sheets, which I made carefully each morning, showed impressions that suggested someone had been sitting on the edge of the mattress. Either someone was entering my room regularly without my knowledge, or I was losing track of my own actions. Both possibilities felt equally terrifying. On the final Friday of November, the pounding from 4H began earlier than usual. I was prepared this time, positioned in the hallway with multiple recording devices and a detailed observation sheet. But as the sounds began, I noticed something I'd missed during previous episodes. The rhythm of the impacts matched exactly with the beating of my own heart. Not approximately, not coincidentally, exactly synchronized, as if whatever was creating the disturbance was somehow monitoring my cardiovascular system and responding in real time to my pulse rate. When my heart accelerated with growing anxiety, the pounding intensified correspondingly. When I forced myself to breathe slowly and lower my heart rate, the impacts became gentler, more spaced out. I stood in that hallway for nearly an hour, experimenting with the correlation between my physiological state and the sounds coming from the empty room. The relationship held consistently. My pulse controlled the pounding, as if my body was somehow broadcasting signals that were being received and amplified by something inside 4H. Security arrived eventually, following the same routine as previous Fridays. They unlocked the empty room, found nothing unusual, and filed another report about inexplicable disturbances and malfunctioning surveillance equipment. But this time, I didn't focus on their investigation. Instead, I paid attention to my own heart rate as they opened the door. The moment the lock disengaged, my pulse doubled. Not from anxiety or anticipation, but spontaneously, as if some external force had suddenly accelerated my cardiovascular system. My heart hammered against my ribs with violent intensity until the guards finished their inspection and relocked the door. Then my pulse returned immediately to normal, leaving me dizzy and nauseous in the hallway. That night I called my parents and told them I was considering a transfer to a different university. Some story about better academic opportunities, more suitable programs for my career goals. They were surprised but supportive, asking only that I finish the current semester before making any major decisions. I agreed, though I wasn't certain I could last another month in the loft. The dreams began that same night. Not nightmares exactly, but vivid, disorienting experiences that left me questioning whether I'd actually been asleep. I would find myself standing in the fourth-floor hallway, always positioned directly in front of 4H, always in the middle of the night when the corridor should have been empty. In these dreams, the door to 4H stood open, revealing an interior that didn't match the layout of other rooms in the building. The space beyond the threshold seemed to extend much further than should have been possible, stretching into darkness that my eyes couldn't penetrate. Sometimes I could hear my own voice echoing from that darkness, calling out questions that I couldn't remember asking. I would wake in my own bed, but with mud on my feet and the magnetic keycard to 4H clutched in my hand. a card I'd never possessed and couldn't have obtained through any normal means. The building management had no record of issuing me access to 4H. The card wasn't registered in their system and shouldn't have worked on any of their locks. But when I tested it one afternoon, while the hallway was empty and the surveillance cameras were supposedly recording every action, the card opened 4H without any difficulty. The room inside was exactly as it should have been, empty, clean, undisturbed. But standing in that space, I could feel something that hadn't been there during the security inspections. A presence that watched from corners I couldn't quite see, that breathed with a rhythm just slightly out of sync with my own. I started spending more time in 4H than in my own room. Not consciously at first. I would realize I was there without remembering the decision to enter. Hours would pass while I sat on the bare floor, listening to sounds that came from nowhere I could identify. Whispers that might have been ventilation systems. Footsteps that could have been my own heartbeat. Conversations and voices that resembled my own, but discussing events I was certain had never happened. My absence from classes went unnoticed initially. Large lecture courses with minimal attendance tracking meant I could disappear for days without triggering any administrative response. But eventually, professors began reaching out, asking about missed assignments and recommending academic support services. I assured them everything was fine. I was simply dedicating more time to an independent research project that had captured my interest. Something related to the psychology of perception and the reliability of memory in stress situations. They seemed satisfied with this explanation, though several mentioned I appeared tired and suggested I might be working too hard. The truth was that I barely slept anymore. The boundary between waking and dreaming had become meaningless. Whether I was in my own room or in 4H, whether my eyes were open or closed, the experiences felt equally real and equally unstable. Time moved in irregular patterns, minutes that felt like hours, hours that passed in what seemed like seconds. My phone showed conversations with friends and family members that I couldn't remember having. Text message exchanges about plans I'd apparently made and then forgotten. Photographs I'd supposedly taken, showing places I'd never visited and people I didn't recognize. Either my memory was deteriorating rapidly, or someone else was living my life while I existed in some parallel state of consciousness. Both explanations led to the same conclusion. I was losing my grip on reality. On the last Friday of the semester, I made a decision. Instead of positioning myself in the hallway to observe the pounding from 4H, I would be inside the room when it began. Whatever was happening, whatever force was creating the disturbances, I would face it directly rather than continuing to exist in this state of uncertain observation. I used the mysterious keycard to enter 4H at 8:30 p.m. The room felt different in the evening light. Shadows fell at angles that didn't quite match the window placement, and the air seemed denser, more resistant to movement. I sat on the floor in the center of the space and waited. At exactly 9 p.m., the pounding began. But I wasn't hearing it from the outside anymore. I was feeling it from within my own body, as if someone was striking the inside of my ribcage with deliberate, measured force. Each impact resonated through my bones, synchronized perfectly with my pulse, but somehow separate from it. And then I heard my own voice, coming from somewhere else in the room, speaking words I wasn't saying. The voice discussed memories I didn't have, described experiences that felt familiar but wrong, recounted conversations with people whose faces I could almost recall but couldn't quite place. It spoke with my vocal patterns, my speech rhythms, my particular way of constructing sentences. But it was talking about a life that belonged to someone else. Or maybe it was talking about my life, and I was the one who didn't belong. As I listened to this other version of myself, I began to understand what was happening on the 4th floor of the Riverside student loft. The doors didn't lock themselves. They were being locked by people who had every right to lock them, who lived in those rooms and followed normal routines of departure and return. The cameras didn't malfunction. They recorded exactly what was there to be recorded, which was an empty corridor where no disturbances were actually occurring. The pounding wasn't coming from inside 4H. It was coming from inside me. And I was the only one who could hear it because I was the only one who existed in the state of consciousness where it made sense. Room 4H had been empty since the beginning of the semester. because I had never actually moved into 4G. The housing office had no record of my residency because I wasn't a resident. The other students on the fourth floor had never really confirmed hearing disturbances. They'd simply been polite to someone who was clearly experiencing some kind of crisis. I was the disturbance. I had been the whole time. The voice that sounded like mine continued talking in the darkness of the empty room, describing a semester of classes I'd never attended, friends I'd never made, experiences I'd never lived. It spoke about parents who had supported an education that wasn't happening, professors who had never learned my name, academic achievements that existed only in my deteriorating consciousness. As Friday turned to Saturday, as the building settled into the quiet rhythms of weekend rest, I remained in 4H, listening to my other self describe the life I thought I'd been living. The two narratives, the one I remembered and the one being spoken, began to merge and separate, creating patterns that made sense for brief moments before dissolving into contradiction. Somewhere in that confusion, I found a kind of peace. The constant anxiety about locked doors and surveillance cameras faded, replaced by acceptance of something I couldn't understand, but no longer needed to fight. When maintenance found me on Monday morning, I was sitting exactly where I'd been for 3 days, conscious but unresponsive, holding a key card that didn't exist in their system, and speaking quietly to someone they couldn't see. The medical evaluation revealed nothing physically wrong. The psychological assessment was more complicated. I could describe my experiences coherently, but the details didn't align with any external verification. The semester I remembered didn't match academic records. The interactions I described had no witnesses. According to official documentation, I'd never enrolled at the university. The Riverside student loft had no record of my application or residence. My parents had no knowledge of tuition payments or housing arrangements, but I remember it all so clearly. The statistical methods classes, the conversations with Jake and Sarah, the research paper about behavioral psychology that I'd been working on when the pounding first began. I remember the texture of the brick walls in my room, the view of the river between buildings, the specific electronic beat pattern of the magnetic lock system. The doctors suggest these memories are elaborate constructions, symptoms of a psychological condition that can create vivid, consistent hallucinations over extended periods. They speak about stress-induced psychosis, about the brain's ability to fabricate entire experiences when reality becomes too difficult to process. They're probably right. But late at night, when the medication wears thin and the boundary between sleeping and waking grows uncertain again, I can still hear the pounding from 4H. I can still feel the rhythm that matches my heartbeat, still hear the voice that sounds like mine describing experiences that feel more real than anything the doctors call reality. And sometimes in the spaces between one breath and the next, I wonder which version of consciousness is the delusion, the one where I lived in the loft, or the one where I never belonged there at all. The answer matters less than the pounding, which continues in frequencies only I can detect, reminding me that some doors are meant to stay locked, and some sounds are meant to remain unheard by anyone except the person who needs to hear them most. Story 11. And the first thing you notice about abandoned places is how they hold their breath. Standing at the edge of Whitmore Airfield, clipboard heavy in my sweating palm, I felt that familiar compression in my chest, the weight of dead air pressing against living lungs. 3 months they'd been paying me to monitor weather patterns at this ghost of a facility, and 3 months I'd been telling myself it was just another contract, just another paycheck and a career spent chasing atmospheric anomalies across forgotten corners of America. But today was different. Today, the wind was wrong. I'd arrived at dawn, same as always, parking my rust-stained pickup beside the chain-link fence that separated the access road from 2 miles of cracked concrete and weeds. The morning mist clung to the runways like smoke from some ancient fire, and through it, I could make out the silhouettes of structures that had once buzzed with purposeful activity. Control tower black against the gray sky, maintenance sheds with their roofs half collapsed, and at the far end, barely visible through the haze, the massive bulk of Hangar 7. The windsocks should have been dancing. At this hour, with the differential heating between the concrete and the surrounding grassland, there should have been at least a light breeze, maybe 5 knots from the southwest. I'd been tracking the patterns here long enough to know the rhythm of this place, the way air moved across its bones like blood through arteries. Instead, every single windsock, all 12 of them scattered along the runways, hung limp and pointing in exactly the same direction, due east, toward Hangar 7. I rubbed my eyes, checked my instruments, walked 50 yards down the perimeter to get a different angle. The orange fabric cylinders remained perfectly still, as if someone had dipped them in starch and positioned them with a compass. No wind that I could feel on my skin, no movement in the grass, no atmospheric pressure reading that would explain what I was seeing. The rational part of my mind, the part trained in fluid dynamics and meteorological theory, began cycling through explanations. Thermal inversion, localized pressure differential, some quirk of the hangar's architecture creating a Venturi effect. But 23 years of reading the sky had taught me to trust my gut, and my gut was saying something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. I started walking toward the hangars. The concrete beneath my boots was worse than I remembered, split by seasons of freeze and thaw into a crazy quilt of gaps that caught the morning light like veins in old skin. Weeds pushed through everywhere, their pale green struggling against the industrial gray. As I moved deeper into the facility, the urban sounds of the highway faded until all I could hear was the soft scuff of my footsteps and the distant hum of power lines. The first time I thought I heard something else, I stopped walking entirely, stood there in the middle of what had once been runway 2, straining my ears against the silence. But there was nothing, just the kind of acoustic emptiness that comes with wide open spaces and no people to fill them. I checked the wind readings again. Still nothing. Still those damn windsocks pointing like accusations. Hangar 7 dominated the eastern edge of the complex, a mountain of corrugated steel that had to be 3 stories tall and long enough to house a jumbo jet. Unlike the other structures, it showed no obvious signs of decay. The massive sliding doors were firmly closed, their tracks clear of debris. A smaller personnel entrance stood to one side, secured with a chain and padlock that looked almost new. As I approached, details began to resolve that made my skin crawl in ways I couldn't articulate. The building was clean, not just well-maintained, but actually clean, as if someone had been washing it regularly. The concrete apron in front of the doors was swept, the drainage gutters clear of leaves and trash. A faint smell hung in the air, ozone and metal and something else I couldn't identify, something organic. I walked the perimeter of the building, noting things a meteorologist had no business noting but couldn't help observing anyway. No windows, no visible ventilation except for a few small grills near the roofline, no equipment or vehicles nearby. But there were tracks in the soft earth behind the hangar, tire tracks, fresh enough that the last rain hadn't washed them away. Someone had been here recently. Someone was maintaining this place. The sound hit me when I rounded the corner to the south side of the building. A low, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, pressing my back against the corrugated wall, feeling the vibration transfer through the metal into my shoulder blades. Not mechanical, not the steady pulse of machinery or generators. This was something else, something that rose and fell like breathing, or like chanting. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, trying to isolate the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from inside the hangar, but muffled, distorted by the building structure until it became more sensation than actual noise. A bass frequency throb that I felt in my chest cavity, in the hollow spaces behind my ribs. And underneath it, barely audible, were the words, "Decola, decola, take off, take off." I knew enough Portuguese from my time working weather stations in Brazil to understand the phrase, but hearing it here, in this context, made my mouth go dry. The words repeated in a steady rhythm, sometimes alone, sometimes layered with other voices, until they became a chorus of whispered urgency. Decola, decola, decola. The rational part of my mind tried to maintain control. Audio illusion. Acoustic reflection from the highway. Wind through the building's structural elements creating harmonics that my brain was interpreting as speech. But my hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to record, and when I played back the audio later, there would be nothing but the sound of my own breathing. I forced myself to move, walking the rest of the perimeter with deliberate, measured steps. The thrumming followed me, always just at the edge of perception, always threatening to resolve into something recognizable before dissolving back into noise. By the time I completed the circuit and returned to the main doors, sweat was running down my spine despite the cool morning air. The padlock on the personnel entrance was newer than I'd initially thought, brass with no signs of weather or oxidation. The chain itself was clean, its links bright enough to reflect the overcast sky. I reached out to touch it, then pulled my hand back. Some instinct, some primitive alarm system, was screaming at me not to make contact with anything connected to this building. Instead, I pressed my ear to the smaller door. The sound was clearer here, no longer muffled by distance and metal walls. Voices, definitely voices, speaking in a language that was mostly Portuguese but peppered with words I didn't recognize. English mixed with something else, something that made my teeth ache. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost musical, rising and falling in patterns that suggested ritual or ceremony. Decola, decola, decola. And then, cutting through the foreign syllables like a blade through fabric, I heard something that made my knees weak. My own name. Not spoken, but whispered with the same rhythmic intensity as the Portuguese phrases. Repeated over and over until it became just another piece of the incomprehensible liturgy flowing from whatever was happening inside that hangar. They knew I was here. They had known I would come. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste to put distance between myself and that door. The voices continued, following me even as I moved away from the building, growing louder instead of softer, as if the speakers were moving closer to the walls, or as if the walls themselves were thinning. The walk back to my truck took forever. Each step felt like moving through molasses, my legs heavy and unresponsive. The windsocks watched my retreat, still pointing toward the hangar, still defying every principle of atmospheric physics I'd spent my career studying. By the time I reached the perimeter fence, the voices had faded, but I could still feel them in my bones, a subliminal vibration that made my fillings ache. I sat in the cab for 20 minutes before I trusted myself to drive, hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. The radio gave me the local weather, clear skies, light winds from the southwest, typical for this time of year. I looked back at the airfield through my rearview mirror and saw the windsocks hanging motionless in the still air, all pointing in the same impossible direction. That night, I dreamed of takeoffs that never ended. Aircraft rising from empty runways, climbing toward a sky that stretched infinitely upward, their engines silent, but their ascent inexorable. In the dream, I was standing in a hangar that was larger on the inside than the outside, watching shadows that moved with purpose but cast no reflections. The air smelled of ozone and burnt metal and something sweet and cloying that made me want to run. When I woke, my sheets were soaked with sweat, and I could taste Portuguese words on my tongue. Words I didn't know but somehow understood. Words about wind and direction and the weight of things that wanted to fly. I called in sick the next day, and the day after that. But contracts have deadlines, and deadlines have consequences. And 3 days later, I found myself back at the chain link fence, staring across 2 miles of cracked concrete at a building that shouldn't have been clean but was. The windsocks hung in their impossible formation, pointing like compass needles towards some magnetic pole that existed only in the space between what I could see and what I could understand. This time I brought recording equipment, digital audio recorders, electromagnetic field detectors, a high-resolution camera with telephoto capabilities. If something was happening in that hangar, something that defied the laws of atmospheric physics and linguistic probability, I was going to document it. I was going to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. The approach took longer this time because I stopped to take measurements every 50 yards. Air pressure, humidity, temperature, wind speed, and direction. The readings were all normal, all within expected parameters for a clear morning in late autumn. But the windsocks remained frozen in their eastern orientation, and as I got closer to Hangar 7, my instruments began to register anomalies that made no scientific sense. Electromagnetic activity where there should have been none. temperature variations that formed no recognizable pattern, air pressure readings that fluctuated wildly despite the absence of any visible weather phenomena. And underneath it all, just below the threshold of conscious hearing, that same rhythmic thrumming I remembered from my previous visit. The voices started when I was still 100 yards away. Not Portuguese this time, but English mixed with something else. Something that sounded like static or radio interference but carried the cadence and intonation of human speech. Words that almost made sense before dissolving into electronic noise, then reforming into phrases that were familiar but wrong, like childhood songs played backward. I set up my equipment at what felt like a safe distance and began recording everything. The audio picked up sounds I couldn't hear with my naked ears, whispers and murmurs and long sustained tones that seemed to come from somewhere far underground. The electromagnetic sensors registered patterns that looked like communication protocols, like some kind of signal being transmitted on frequencies that hadn't been used for decades. And through it all, my name kept surfacing in the electronic babble like debris from a shipwreck. By noon, I had 3 hours of recordings and 7 memory cards full of photographs that showed nothing unusual except for those damn windsocks. The hangar looked exactly as it had before, clean, secure, and somehow wrong, in ways that couldn't be quantified or measured. But the data I'd collected told a different story, a story of electromagnetic anomalies and acoustic phenomena that had no business existing in an abandoned airfield in the middle of nowhere. I packed up my equipment and drove home, telling myself I had proof now, evidence that something genuinely unusual was happening at Whitmore Airfield. But when I played back the recordings that evening, sitting in my kitchen with the lights on and the doors locked, I heard nothing but wind and the distant sound of traffic. The photographs showed empty runways and a clean hangar and windsocks that hung limp in still air, pointing in random directions like any normal windsock on any normal day. I've been back 17 times since then, always with equipment, always with the hope of capturing something that would validate what I know I experienced. The contract ended 2 months ago, but I keep returning anyway, drawn by a need to understand that has become stronger than my need to stay sane. The windsocks still point toward Hangar 7 when I'm there, though they return to normal positions when viewed through cameras or by anyone else I've brought along. The voices still call my name in languages that don't exist, though no recording device has ever captured them. And sometimes, on very still mornings when the mist clings to the runways like accusation made visible, I can see shapes moving behind the hangar's high windows. Windows that aren't there when I look directly at them. I've stopped trying to prove what's happening at Whitmore Airfield. Proof, I've learned, is a luxury for people who haven't heard their own name whispered in dead languages by voices that may not exist. Instead, I visit when the pull becomes too strong to resist, and I listen to the wind that isn't there tell me about takeoffs that will never end, about aircraft climbing toward a sky that exists only in the space between seeing and believing. The hangar remains sealed. The voices remain impossible. And somewhere in the gap between rational explanation and inexplicable experience, I remain suspended like those motionless windsocks, pointing toward a truth I may never be equipped to understand. Decola, decola, they whisper on windless days. Decola, decola. And sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I find myself whispering back. Story 12. The fluorescent lights overhead had been dead for 3 months, but I could still hear their phantom hum in the darkness of Ward 7. The medical wing had been decommissioned after the budget cuts, leaving behind only empty beds with their thin mattresses and the lingering scent of disinfectant that never quite masked the underlying smell of something else, something organic and wrong. I shouldn't have been there. The academy had strict protocols about unauthorized access to abandoned facilities, but the barracks felt like a pressure cooker lately. Too many bodies, too much tension, too many nights listening to Rodriguez's nightmares echoing through the thin walls. The deactivated infirmary offered something the dormitories couldn't: silence. Or so I thought. I'd been lying on one of the narrow beds for maybe 20 minutes, staring up at the ceiling tiles that sagged like skin in the humid air. The academy was built in Louisiana swampland, and even the newest buildings seemed to exhale moisture. Here in Ward 7, the humidity felt alive, pressing against my skin with patient fingers. That's when I first saw it. At the periphery of my vision, a shadow shifted against the far wall. Not the ordinary movement of darkness adjusting to my presence, but something deliberate, purposeful. I turned my head slowly, the way Sergeant Morrison had taught us during night reconnaissance exercises. Never make sudden movements that might give away your position. The shadow was gone. I lay still for several minutes, listening to the buildings settle around me. Old hospitals make their own music, the whisper of air through defunct ventilation systems, the tick of cooling pipes, the occasional groan of supports adjusting to temperature changes. But underneath those familiar sounds, I caught something else. A rhythm that didn't belong. Tap, tap, tap. Like fingernails on glass, soft and persistent. I sat up slowly, scanning the room. 20 beds in 2 rows, medical equipment shrouded in dust covers, cabinets with their doors slightly ajar. Everything exactly as it had been when I'd entered. Yet the tapping continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Tap, tap, tap. Hello? The word escaped before I could stop it, hanging in the stale air like an accusation. The tapping stopped immediately, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like cotton in my ears. I should have left then. Every instinct screamed at me to grab my boots and get back to the barracks, regulations be damned. Instead, I found myself lying back down, telling myself it was just the building's natural sounds, distorted by the acoustics. Old places play tricks on the mind. Everyone knows that. The darkness seemed to thicken as I settled back against the thin pillow. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on my breathing. The meditation techniques we'd learned in stress management class. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. The rhythm should have been soothing, but instead it seemed to synchronize with something else. A pulse in the walls themselves. When I opened my eyes again, the shadow had returned. This time it wasn't at the periphery of my vision. It stood at the foot of my bed, a dark mass roughly the size and shape of a person, but wrong in ways my mind struggled to process. The edges weren't clean like a normal shadow should be. Instead, they seemed to shift and writhe, as if the darkness was fighting to hold its form. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced myself to remain still. Maybe it was a trick of exhaustion, my brain conjuring phantoms from too many sleepless nights and too much caffeine. Maybe someone was playing an elaborate prank, though I couldn't imagine how they'd create such an effect. The shadow thing began to move. It didn't walk or glide. Instead, it seemed to unfold, expanding outward in a slow spiral that defied every law of physics I'd ever learned. The darkness spread like spilled ink, but in reverse, gathering mass and density as it grew. And as it expanded, I began to hear something that made my blood ice over. Whispering. Not words in any language I recognized, but the cadence was unmistakably human, urgent and pleading, as if the shadow was trying to communicate something vital. The whispers seemed to come from inside my own head, bypassing my ears entirely and settling directly into my brainstem. I tried to move, to roll off the bed and run, but my body wouldn't respond. Not paralyzed exactly, but disconnected, as if the signals from my brain were traveling through thick syrup before reaching my muscles. The shadow continued its spiral expansion, and now I could see details that shouldn't have been possible in the darkness. Eyes. Hundreds of them, opening and closing within the writhing mass like stars blinking in a poisoned sky, and mouths, all moving in that same urgent whisper, speaking words that I almost but not quite understood. Terror gave way to something worse. Recognition. Some primal part of my mind knew this thing, had been expecting it. The knowledge felt inherited, genetic, as if my ancestors had faced this same darkness and passed down the memory through blood and bone. That's when the war prayer came to me. I'd learned it during psychological warfare training, along with a dozen other mental conditioning techniques designed to maintain focus under extreme stress. At the time, it had seemed like military mysticism, the kind of quasi-religious ritual that old soldiers swore by, but no one took seriously. The instructor, a grizzled veteran whose left hand shook from what he claimed was an old injury, had made us repeat it until the words were carved into our muscle memory. Steel in my spine, stone in my heart, shadow flee before the light of purpose. The words tumbled from my lips without conscious thought, and the effect was immediate. The shadow thing recoiled as if struck, its spiral expansion reversing so rapidly that the air seemed to snap back into place with an audible pop. The whispers cut off mid-syllable, leaving behind a silence that felt wounded. Within seconds, the darkness had contracted back to its original size and shape before dissolving entirely, leaving me alone with my racing heart and the phantom taste of copper in my mouth. I lay there for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. Eventually, exhaustion won out over fear, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep filled with dreams of spiral staircases that led nowhere, and voices calling my name from rooms that didn't exist. I woke to pale sunlight filtering through the grimy windows. My watch showed 06:30, reveille in 30 minutes. I'd slept through the night without further incident, but my clothes were soaked with sweat, and my jaw ached as if I'd been clenching it for hours. The walk back to the barracks felt surreal, like moving through a world that had shifted slightly off its axis while I slept. Other cadets passed me in the corridors, heading to breakfast or early PT, but their voices seemed to come from a great distance. I nodded when spoken to, responded appropriately to casual greetings, but felt like I was operating my body by remote control. Rodriguez was already up when I entered our shared room, struggling with his dress uniform. He looked like hell, pale, hollow-eyed, hands trembling slightly as he tried to work the buttons. "You look worse than I feel," he said without looking up. "Another all-nighter in the study hall?" I told him I'd been in the library, which wasn't entirely a lie. He accepted this without question, too focused on his own problems to probe deeper. But as I gathered my gear for morning inspection, I noticed him watching me in the mirror, with an expression I couldn't quite read. The next few days passed in a haze of routine military life. Classes, drills, meals consumed without tasting, conversations that I participated in but didn't really hear. My instructors noticed nothing amiss. My performance remained solid, my demeanor appropriately focused. But inside, I felt like I was waiting for something. Every shadow seemed darker than it should be. Every unexpected sound made me flinch. I tried to convince myself that what I'd experienced in Ward 7 was nothing more than a stress-induced hallucination. The human mind is remarkably creative when pushed to its limits, and the academy environment was designed to test those limits. Sleep deprivation, constant pressure, the anxiety of failing out and disappointing everyone who'd invested in my success. All perfectly reasonable explanations for a brief psychotic episode. But the war prayer bothered me. Where had those specific words come from? I'd looked them up in my training materials but could find no reference to that exact phrasing. When I asked our psychological warfare instructor about it after class, he gave me a long, measuring look before shaking his head. "Never heard it," he said, but something in his eyes suggested otherwise. "Probably something you picked up from an old war movie. Hollywood loves that mystical soldier bullshit." His dismissal should have been reassuring. Instead, it left me with the uncomfortable feeling that he was lying. A week later, I found myself back in Ward 7. I told myself I was going there to prove that the first incident had been a hallucination, to confront the phantom and watch it dissolve under rational scrutiny. But as I lay on the same narrow bed, staring at the same sagging ceiling tiles, I knew the truth was more complicated. I was hoping to see it again. The shadow appeared exactly as before, first at the periphery of my vision, then at the foot of the bed, then beginning its impossible spiral expansion. This time I was ready for the whispers, the eyes, the overwhelming sense of ancient recognition. This time, I let it get closer before speaking the prayer. Steel in my spine, stone in my heart, shadow flee before the light of purpose. The effect was identical: instant recoil, rapid contraction, dissolution into ordinary darkness. But this time, I thought I caught something else in the moment before it vanished. a sense of frustration, of interrupted communication, as if the shadow thing had been trying to tell me something important, and my prayer had cut the connection just before the message could be delivered. Over the following weeks, these nocturnal visits became routine. I would slip away from the barracks after lights out, make my way to Ward 7, and wait for the shadow to appear. Always the same bed, always the same sequence of events, always the same result when I spoke the prayer. But with each encounter, the thing seemed to linger a little longer before beginning its retreat, as if it was learning to resist the word's power, and I was changing too. My reflection in the bathroom mirrors began to look strange to me, familiar yet somehow wrong, like a photograph of myself taken by someone who didn't quite understand how I was supposed to look. Food lost most of its taste. Colors seemed muted, as if I was seeing the world through tinted glass. Sleep became elusive. Even when exhaustion finally pulled me under, I would wake feeling like I hadn't rested at all. Rodriguez noticed first. He started asking pointed questions about my health, my stress levels, whether I was taking any medications. When I brushed off his concerns, he began watching me with that same unreadable expression I'd caught glimpses of before. Other classmates began to notice too, subtle changes in how they interacted with me, conversations that died when I approached, glances exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking. I should have been alarmed by these changes. Instead, I felt oddly detached from them, as if they were happening to someone else entirely. My real life had become those midnight encounters in Ward 7, those moments of contact with something vast and unknowable. Everything else was just marking time. Then came the night when the shadow spoke to me. I'd been lying on the bed for perhaps 10 minutes when it appeared, manifesting with the same spiral expansion I'd grown accustomed to. But this time, instead of the usual formless whispers, I heard words. My name, spoken in a voice that was somehow both foreign and intimately familiar. Thomas, it said, and the sound seemed to come from inside my own throat. Thomas, listen to me. The war prayer rose automatically to my lips, but before I could speak it, the shadow thing contracted slightly, its movements suddenly urgent. Please, it said, don't send me away. Not yet. I need you to understand. I lay frozen, torn between terror and fascination. The prayer hung unspoken in my mouth like a loaded weapon, ready to banish this thing back to whatever realm it inhabited. But something in its voice, a note of desperate sincerity, made me hesitate. What are you? I whispered. The shadow pulsed, its edges rippling like water disturbed by wind. I am what you will become, it said. What we all become in the end, the space between what is and what should be. That doesn't make sense. Nothing makes sense until it's too late. The thing's voice carried infinite sadness. The prayer you speak, do you know what it really does? I shook my head, not trusting my voice. It severs the connection, the shadow said, cuts the cord between who you are and who you might be. Each time you speak it, you lose a piece of yourself. Each time you become a little less real. You're lying. Look in a mirror, it whispered. Really look. What do you see? Before I could respond, the shadow began to contract on its own, shrinking back to human proportions without any prompting from me. But just before it disappeared entirely, it spoke one final time. The prayer doesn't banish us, Thomas. It creates us. I ran from Ward 7 that night, my boots echoing through the empty corridors like gunshots. Back in the barracks, I went straight to the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror above the sink. What I saw there made my blood turn to ice water. My reflection was fading, not disappearing entirely, but becoming translucent, as if I was slowly turning into a photographic negative. I could see the bathroom wall through my face, the tile pattern visible beneath my skin like a watermark. When I moved, my reflection lagged slightly behind, as if it was having trouble keeping up with the original. I spent the rest of the night sitting on my bunk, trying to make sense of what I'd learned. The war prayer that I'd thought was protecting me, could it really be doing the opposite? Each time I'd spoken those words, had I been giving away another piece of my own existence? The questions multiplied in my mind like cancer cells, each one spawning two more. If the shadow was telling the truth, then what was I becoming? And if I stopped using the prayer, would the next encounter with the shadow thing be my last as a human being? But the most terrifying question of all was this: did I even want to stop? The shadow had spoken with such certainty, such ancient knowledge. When it looked at me with those countless eyes, I felt truly seen for the first time in my life. Not as Cadet Thompson, not as a uniform and a set of test scores, but as something deeper and more essential. Something that existed beyond the narrow boundaries of military protocol and societal expectation. Maybe fading away wasn't a curse. Maybe it was evolution. I never returned to Ward 7, but I didn't need to. The shadows found me wherever I went now, in my room, in the mess hall, during training exercises. They spoke to me constantly, their whispers weaving through my thoughts like smoke through a building's ventilation system. And with each passing day, I felt myself becoming more like them, substantial enough to function in the world, but increasingly detached from its concerns. Rodriguez was the first to notice that something was fundamentally wrong. He cornered me after our tactical operations exam, his face pale with concern. "Thompson, I need you to listen to me very carefully," he said. "When was the last time you remember eating a full meal?" I tried to answer, but realized I couldn't. The memories were there, but distant and hollow, like watching someone else's home movies. "When was the last time you slept for more than an hour at a stretch?" Again, nothing. Just the vague impression of lying down, of closing my eyes, of time passing without true rest. "Jesus Christ," Rodriguez whispered. "What the hell is happening to you?" I wanted to tell him about Ward 7, about the shadows, about the war prayer that was slowly erasing me from existence. Instead, I heard myself say that everything was fine, that he was imagining things, that he should focus on his own problems instead of manufacturing mine. The words came out in my voice, but they felt like someone else's thoughts. That night, I sat in my room and tried to remember what it felt like to be fully human. The harder I concentrated, the more elusive the memories became, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. I could recall the mechanics of human existence, eating, sleeping, laughing at jokes, but not the substance of it. Not what it actually felt like to be alive in my own skin. Outside my window, the Louisiana night pressed against the glass like a living thing, and in its depths I could see dozens of shadows moving with purpose and intelligence, their spiral forms dancing to music only they could hear. Soon I knew I would join them. The realization should have terrified me. Instead, it felt like coming home. I never spoke the war prayer again. But late at night, when the academy sleeps and the shadows come calling, I sometimes whisper other words, older words, in languages that predate human speech. Words that don't banish the darkness but welcome it, that don't sever connections but forge new ones. Rodriguez still asks about me sometimes. I see him in the corridors, his eyes searching my face for traces of the person I used to be. But I'm not sure what he sees there anymore. I'm not sure what anyone sees when they look at me. Sometimes I catch my reflection in windows or mirrors, and the image looking back seems surprised to find itself there, as if it's forgotten what it was supposed to be doing. The military doctors say I'm suffering from stress-related dissociation, that a few weeks of counseling and medication will restore my normal psychological functioning. They don't understand that normal is the last thing I want to be. The shadows whisper to me of a world beyond the narrow boundaries of human perception, a reality where the impossible becomes inevitable, and the ancient rules no longer apply. They promise knowledge and power and freedom from the tyranny of linear existence. All I have to do is let go. All I have to do is stop pretending to be real. The academy graduation ceremony is next week. My parents will be there, proud and beaming, ready to watch their son receive his commission as a second lieutenant. They'll see the uniform, the medals, the confident posture of a young officer ready to serve his country. But what will they really be looking at? What will be looking back? Steel in my spine, stone in my heart, shadow flee before the light of purpose. The words echo in my memory like a funeral dirge for whoever I used to be. And in the growing darkness of my room, dozens of spiral shadows dance in celebration of whoever I'm becoming. The war prayer worked exactly as advertised. It just wasn't designed to protect the person speaking it. Story 13. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as I made my way through the storage facility's endless corridors, clipboard in hand, and the weight of another mandatory inventory pressing down on my shoulders. 23 years I'd been doing this job, and the ritual never changed. Count, verify, initial, move on. The company trusted me with their precious records, their archived contracts, their forgotten documents that nobody would ever need but everyone insisted on keeping. My footsteps echoed against the concrete walls, each sound sharp and isolated in the cavernous space. The facility stretched on like an underground city, row upon row of identical storage units filled with the detritus of corporate memory. I'd started at dawn, working methodically through sections A through M, and now the afternoon sun filtered weakly through the high windows, casting long shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The air grew thicker as I descended deeper into the facility. Down here, the ventilation system struggled against the weight of accumulated years, and I could taste the metallic tang of old paper and forgotten time. My shirt clung to my back despite the chill that seemed to seep up from the floor itself. Section N was particularly cramped, the units packed tighter together as if the building had compressed under its own weight. I moved through the narrow aisles, checking serial numbers against my list, making notes about damaged boxes and moisture concerns. Everything seemed normal, routine even, until I reached the final storage unit in the row. Unit N47 stood slightly ajar, which was unusual. Protocol demanded that all units remain locked unless being actively accessed. I approached slowly, my hand instinctively reaching for the heavy flashlight clipped to my belt. The metal door creaked as I pulled it open wider, the sound unnaturally loud in the confined space. The beam of my flashlight swept across shelves lined with standard storage boxes, each labeled with dates spanning the last decade. Nothing appeared out of place, yet something felt fundamentally wrong. The air inside the unit was colder than the already chilly corridor, and I could hear a faint sound, like paper rustling in a breeze that shouldn't exist in this sealed space. I stepped inside, my breathing shallow and controlled. The familiar smell of old documents was there, but underneath it lurked something else, something that reminded me of the way rain smells just before a storm. My pulse quickened without any rational cause, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder at the empty doorway behind me. The boxes on the lower shelves were standard issue, their contents properly cataloged and stored. But as my light moved upward, I noticed something strange about the highest shelf. A single box sat alone in the corner, smaller than the others, and covered in a layer of dust that seemed too thick for its supposed age. I had to stand on tiptoe to reach it, my fingers barely able to grasp the edge. The moment I touched the cardboard, a wave of dizziness swept over me. The storage unit seemed to tilt and spin, and I gripped the shelving unit to keep from falling. My vision blurred at the edges, and for a moment I thought I might pass out entirely. The sensation passed as quickly as it had come, leaving me shaken and confused. I'd never experienced anything like it. Not a dizzy spell exactly, but something deeper, as if the very ground beneath my feet had shifted into uncertainty. My hands trembled slightly as I lowered the box to a more manageable height. Inside, instead of the expected documents or files, I found something that made my blood run cold. Dozens of sheets of paper, each bearing the same thing, my signature. Not photocopies or scanned images, but actual signatures in my own handwriting, complete with the subtle variations and pressure points that made each one unique and unmistakably mine. But that wasn't the worst part. Each signature was dated, and every single date was tomorrow's. I stared at the papers, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The signatures looked authentic. More than authentic. They looked exactly like the ones I'd been writing all day on my inventory sheets. Same pen pressure, same slight tremor in the final letter that I'd developed over years of repetitive signing. Yet I had no memory of creating any of these. My heart hammered against my ribs as I examined each sheet more closely. Some signatures appeared to be practice runs, with multiple attempts scattered across the page. Others were single, perfect executions of my name, positioned exactly where a signature would go on an official document. The dates were written in different handwriting, not mine, but careful and precise, as if whoever had written them wanted to ensure there was no mistake about when these signatures were supposed to be used. The storage unit suddenly felt impossibly small, the walls pressing in around me. I stuffed the papers back into the box, my movements clumsy and urgent. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to pretend I'd never found this box, never seen those impossible signatures. But I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the concrete floor, and a terrible certainty was growing in my chest. Someone had been practicing my signature, someone who had access to this facility, this locked storage unit, someone who knew I would be here today, conducting this inventory, someone who was planning something for tomorrow. I forced myself to think rationally. There had to be an explanation. Maybe a coworker was planning a surprise, a retirement party or birthday celebration. Maybe someone needed my signature for paperwork and had been practicing to forge it for a harmless prank. But even as I tried to convince myself of these innocent possibilities, I knew they didn't explain the cold dread that had settled in my stomach. The rustling sound grew louder, and I realized it was coming from the papers in my own hands. They were shaking with my tremor, creating their own disturbing whisper in the silence. I set the box down and wiped my palms on my pants, but the moisture immediately returned. That's when I noticed something else about the storage unit. On the back wall, barely visible in the dim light, someone had written a series of numbers in pencil. They looked like coordinates, or perhaps a combination to something. Below them, in the same careful handwriting as the dates on my signatures, were the words, "Ready by end of inventory." My inventory. Today's inventory. Which meant whatever these signatures were for, whatever was being planned, it was supposed to happen soon. Very soon. I backed out of the storage unit, leaving the box behind but unable to shake the image of those signatures from my mind. Each one had been perfect. Too perfect. As if whoever had created them had not just studied my handwriting, but somehow channeled the exact muscle memory, the precise movements that made my signature uniquely mine. The corridor seemed different now, darker despite the unchanging fluorescent lights. Every shadow looked deeper, every sound more ominous. I found myself checking over my shoulder constantly, certain that someone was watching me, following me, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. My clipboard felt foreign in my hands, and when I tried to continue my inventory, I discovered something disturbing. My handwriting had changed. The signatures I was making now looked slightly different from the ones I'd been creating all morning, as if seeing those practice sheets had somehow altered my own muscle memory, contaminated my natural writing style with echoes of someone else's interpretation of it. I completed the remaining units in Section N with mechanical precision, my mind reeling with questions I couldn't answer. Who had access to this facility? Who knew my signature well enough to replicate it so perfectly? And most importantly, what did they need it for tomorrow? The walk back to the main office felt endless. Every footstep echoed with new menace, and I could swear I heard other footsteps following mine, always just far enough behind to remain invisible when I turned around. The fluorescent lights seemed to flicker more frequently, casting strobing shadows that made the corridor appear to shift and breathe around me. By the time I reached my desk, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my pen to complete the inventory report. I tried to focus on the mundane task of transferring numbers from my clipboard to the official forms, but my signature at the bottom of each page looked wrong, foreign, as if someone else was controlling my hand. I stayed late that evening, long after the other employees had gone home. I told myself I was catching up on paperwork, but really I was afraid to leave. Afraid that going home would somehow trigger whatever plan those signatures were meant to facilitate. As long as I remained at the office, as long as tomorrow hadn't actually arrived, perhaps I could prevent whatever was supposed to happen. But tomorrow would come whether I was ready or not. And somewhere in storage unit N47, dozens of perfect copies of my signature waited to be used for purposes I couldn't imagine. but somehow knew I should fear. The building settled around me as night fell, pipes creaking and ventilation systems humming their electronic lullabies. I sat at my desk, staring at my own handwriting on the day's reports, trying to convince myself that what I'd found was somehow explainable, somehow innocent. But deep down, in the part of my mind that had kept me alive for 47 years by recognizing danger when it appeared, I knew the truth. Tomorrow was coming, and when it arrived, my signature would be ready for whatever purpose someone else had planned. The question that haunted me as I finally locked up the office and walked to my car was simple but terrifying. Would I be